The first thing I noticed about the cabin was the silence. Not the peaceful kind you expect near a lake. This silence felt wrong. The water of Blackwater Lake barely moved. No birds, no insects, just the slow creaking of the old wooden dock and the wind brushing against the trees like something breathing. I remember standing there with my duffel bag, staring at the cabin, wondering why it had been so cheap. Now I know. But at the time, I told myself it was just because the place was old. The cabin sat about 30 feet from the edge of the lake. One story, dark wood, a slanted roof that looked like it had survived too many winters. The windows were small and dusty, reflecting the gray water behind me. I had rented it online 2 days earlier. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of silence, so I could finally finish my book. At least that was the plan. The drive out here had taken almost 6 hours. By the time I reached the small town near the lake, the sun was already low, and the sky had that pale orange glow that only shows up right before evening. The town itself looked like it had been shrinking for decades. One gas station, one diner, a few old houses leaning toward the road like tired people. I stopped at the gas station first. The old man behind the counter barely looked up when I walked in. He had a thick gray beard and one of those old radios playing country music behind him. I grabbed a bottle of water and set it on the counter. Passing through, he asked without much interest. "Not exactly," I said. "I'm staying out by Blackwater Lake." That's when he finally looked up. "Not surprised. Just curious. Fishing trip." "Riding trip," I said. "Cabin rental." He stared at me for a moment, longer than normal people usually do. Then he asked something strange. "Which cabin?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the listing. "Cabin 14. The man leaned closer to the screen. Then he slowly shook his head. "Haven't seen anyone stay there in years." At first, I thought he meant the owner didn't rent it often. But the way he said it didn't sound like that. "What do you mean?" I asked. He didn't answer right away, just rang up my water. The total came to $2. While the register drawer was still open, he spoke again. "Folks around here don't really go near that side of the lake." "Why?" He shrugged. "Just the way it is." I waited for more, but none came. The radio kept playing softly behind him. Finally, I said, "Is something wrong with the place?" The man closed the register drawer. Then he leaned both hands on the counter. "You ever notice," he said slowly, "how some places feel like they're watching?" I laughed a little, mostly because I didn't know how else to react. "It's a cabin," I said. He nodded. "Sure." That was the entire conversation. I left the store feeling slightly uneasy, but I told myself small towns were always like that. People like to scare outsiders. It wasn't a big deal. At least that's what I thought while I drove the narrow road toward the lake. The road twisted through thick forest for about 20 minutes before the trees suddenly opened up. That's when I first saw Blackwater Lake. It looked darker than any lake I had ever seen. Not just deep water dark. The surface had this strange gray color, almost like dull metal under the cloudy sky. The cabin road ran along the shore for a mile before ending in a small gravel clearing. Cabin 14 sat alone at the very end. No other cabins nearby. No boats. No lights. Just trees and water. When I parked the car, the quiet hit me immediately. Even the wind felt muted. I stepped out and stretched my back after the long drive. The air smelled damp, like wet wood and lake water. The cabin door was unlocked, just like the rental message said. Inside, the place was smaller than I expected. One main room, a small kitchen area, a couch facing a stone fireplace, and a writing desk by the window. That desk was the reason I chose this place. The window looked straight out over the lake. Perfect view, perfect silence, perfect isolation. Exactly what a tired writer needed. I dropped my bag near the couch and opened the window slightly to let the air in. The lake looked even darker now that the sun was lowering behind the trees. For a while I just stood there, staring at the water. Something about it felt heavy, like the lake had weight to it. After unpacking a few things, I decided to walk down to the dock before it got dark. The boards groaned under my feet as I stepped onto it. It stretched about 20 feet into the water. At the end of the dock, the lake spread out like a giant sheet of black glass. No ripples, no movement, just stillness. I sat down at the edge and let my feet dangle above the water. That's when I noticed something strange. Across the lake, maybe 200 yards away, there was a patch of forest that looked darker than the rest. Thicker, almost like the trees were packed too close together. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving between them. But it was probably just wind shifting the branches. Still, I kept staring longer than I meant to, waiting to see if it moved again. It didn't. The sun slipped lower, and the lake slowly turned black. A cold breeze brushed across the water, making the dock creak softly beneath me. That's when I heard it, a faint splash somewhere behind me. I turned quickly. Nothing, just the cabin and the empty shoreline. Maybe a fish. I shrugged it off. But when I looked back at the water, the surface near the dock had small ripples spreading outward, like something had just moved underneath. I leaned forward, trying to see deeper into the dark water. But it was impossible. Blackwater Lake lived up to its name. You couldn't see more than a few inches down. I stayed there another minute. Then two. The ripples slowly faded. Everything became still again. I told myself I was being paranoid. Long drive. New place. My brain was just adjusting. So I stood up and walked back toward the cabin. But right before I stepped off the dock, something strange caught my attention. The cabin window. The one above the writing desk. From the angle I was standing, the glass reflected the lake behind me. And for just a second, I thought I saw a shape move inside the cabin. A dark figure passing behind the window. My heart skipped. I turned around immediately. The cabin door was still closed. No lights inside. No movement. I walked up the short path quickly and opened the door. The cabin was empty, exactly the way I left it. My bag by the couch, notebook on the desk, chair pushed in. Nothing disturbed. I stood there for a moment, listening. The same quiet, the same heavy stillness. Finally, I shook my head and laughed under my breath. Great start, I muttered, already imagining things. I locked the door this time, just in case, and started setting up my laptop on the desk. Night was settling over the lake now. Through the window, the water had become a wide black mirror under the cloudy sky. I stared at it for a while, trying to think of something to write. But my mind kept drifting back to what the man at the gas station said. You ever notice how some places feel like they're watching? I didn't like that thought, so I pushed it away, opened my document, placed my fingers on the keyboard, and tried to focus on my book. But about 20 minutes later, something outside the cabin made a sound. Soft, wood against wood, like a footstep. On the dock, I froze. The sound came again. Slow, careful. One board creaking, then another. Someone was walking out there. But that didn't make sense. No cars. no houses nearby. And when I looked through the window toward the dock, I couldn't see anyone, only the dark lake and the empty dock, still creaking. The footsteps stopped the moment I stood up. Just silence again. I stayed frozen beside the desk, staring through the window at the dock, my ears strained so hard it almost hurt. Nothing moved. The dock stretched out into the lake exactly the way it had before. Dark boards, black water, the same quiet air. For a second I wondered if I had imagined the sound. But the wood had creaked, I was sure of it. Slow, heavy, like someone shifting their weight from one step to the next. I moved closer to the window. The glass was cold against my forehead as I leaned forward and looked down toward the dock. Still empty. A strange feeling crept up my spine. Not fear exactly. More like the uneasy sense that something had just slipped away the moment I tried to look at it. I waited another minute. Then two. Nothing. Finally, I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and stepped outside. The night air had turned colder, the kind of cold that sneaks under your clothes and makes you aware of every inch of your skin. The forest behind the cabin was completely dark now, just tall shadows stacked together like walls. I aimed the flashlight beam toward the dock. The boards looked wet and pale under the light. I walked slowly toward it. Each step felt louder than it should have. Crunch of gravel, soft brush of wind, and underneath it all, the lake breathing quietly beside me. When I reached the dock, I paused, half expecting to see wet footprints. There weren't any. The boards looked the same as before. Old, dry, a few cracks running through the wood. I stepped onto it carefully. Creak. The sound echoed across the water. I took another step. Same creak. Same hollow sound. It made sense now. Old docks always sound like that, wood shifting, nails moving. That must have been what I heard from inside. Just the structure settling in the cold night air. I stood there for a while, letting the calm return. The lake stretched out in front of me like a dark sheet of glass. No waves, no ripples. Then something caught my eye. A faint glow, far out on the water. At first, I thought it was a reflection from the sky. But the sky above the lake was almost completely dark now. The glow moved. Slowly, left to right. I leaned forward. The light was small, maybe the size of a flashlight beam pointed downward. It drifted across the water, about halfway to the other side of the lake. Then it stopped. My brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe a boat. Someone fishing at night. That would explain it. Except I couldn't see a boat. No silhouette. No sound of a motor. Just the light itself floating above the water. A soft white glow. Then it dimmed. For a second, it disappeared completely. And just when I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, another light appeared. A second one. A little farther to the right. My stomach tightened. 2 lights now. Both moving slowly. Not toward the shore. Just across the surface. Like someone walking out there. That idea made me laugh under my breath. Walking on water. Right. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The first light came back. 3 lights now. They moved quietly across the lake in a loose line. No splashing. No waves. Just drifting. I stood there watching them for maybe 30 seconds. Then the lights blinked out. All at once, the lake went completely dark again. For a long moment I stayed frozen on the dock, waiting for them to return. They didn't. Eventually the cold started to bite through my jacket, so I headed back toward the cabin. Inside felt warmer immediately. Safer too. I locked the door again and sat down at the desk. For a while, I tried to focus on writing. But every few minutes, my eyes drifted back toward the window, toward the lake. Nothing happened for the next hour. Just quiet darkness. Eventually, the tension faded enough that I started typing again. Words came slowly, but they came. The story on my screen began to take shape. Around midnight, I finally leaned back in the chair and stretched my arms. My shoulders felt tight from sitting too long. That's when I heard it again. Creak. I froze. The sound came from outside. From the dock. Exactly the same as before. One slow step. Then another. Creak. Creak. My heart started beating faster. I slowly turned my head toward the window. The dock was empty, but the sound continued. Another step. Wood bending slightly under weight. Someone walking out there. Except no one was there. The dock looked perfectly still under the faint moonlight. Yet the boards kept groaning one by one. I stood up slowly. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Pretend it was just the wind. But there was no wind tonight. And the steps sounded deliberate. Like someone packing slowly toward the end of the dock. Creak. 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 The sound stopped. Right at the far end. The exact spot where I had been sitting earlier. My mouth felt dry. I waited. 10 seconds passed. 20. Nothing. Then the sound started again. But this time, it was coming back toward the shore. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. Because whoever or whatever was making those sounds was walking back toward the cabin. The last creak sounded right near the base of the dock. Then everything went silent again. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I just stared at the door, waiting for a knock, waiting for the handle to turn. But nothing happened. Minutes passed. Finally, I forced myself to step closer to the window. The dock looked empty. The shoreline looked empty. The lake stretched out in the darkness like nothing had ever disturbed it. I exhaled slowly. Maybe it really was just the wood shifting after all. Maybe the temperature change at night made the boards expand or something. That explanation felt weak, but it was the only one I had. Eventually, the exhaustion from the long drive started to take over. My eyes felt heavy. The chair felt too comfortable. So I shut the laptop and decided to get some sleep. The bedroom was small, just a narrow bed and a small window facing the lake. I turned off the main light and lay down. The mattress creaked under my weight. For a while I just stared at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. No footsteps. No strange sounds. Just the faint lap of water against the shore. Slowly my breathing relaxed. Sleep started pulling me under. And just before I drifted off, a soft glow filled the bedroom. My eyes opened. The lake outside, the window was glowing again. Not just one light this time. There were many. At least 6 or 7. They floated across the water like small drifting lanterns, moving in slow circles, almost searching. I sat up in bed and watched them. They stayed out there for a long time, long enough that my fear slowly changed into something else. Curiosity, because the lights weren't random. They kept moving toward one specific place, the end of the dock. My dock. One by one, the lights drifted closer to shore, then stopped about 20 feet away, all of them hovering in the same spot, perfectly still, like they were waiting. And that's when I heard the footsteps again. This time, right outside the cabin. The footsteps didn't stop at the dock that night. They came all the way to the cabin. I remember lying in bed, staring at the faint glow of those lights floating over the lake, when I heard gravel crunch outside the window. Slow, heavy, like someone walking carefully around the house. My whole body went still. The bedroom window faced the lake, but the sound came from the side of the cabin, near the wall, close enough that whoever it was could reach out and touch the wood. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Each step dragged across the gravel like the person was tired or injured. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I sat up slowly. Part of me wanted to call out, ask who was there, but the thought died before it even reached my mouth. Because there shouldn't have been anyone out there. No neighbors. No road nearby. Nothing but forest and water. The footsteps stopped just beneath the window. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then something brushed lightly against the outside wall. A slow scrape. Wood against something rough. I held my breath. My eyes stayed fixed on the window. The glow from the lake still filled the room faintly, turning everything pale and gray. But the glass showed nothing. Just the dark water behind me, and the floating lights drifting quietly on the surface. Eventually the sounds faded. The gravel shifted once more. Then nothing. The silence returned like a heavy blanket. I stayed awake for a long time after that, listening, waiting, but whoever had walked around the cabin never came back. At some point, exhaustion finally dragged me into sleep. When morning came, the lake looked normal again. No strange lights. No glowing water. Just dull gray waves under a cloudy sky. For a moment, I wondered if I had dreamed the whole thing. Until I stepped outside. The gravel beside the cabin had been disturbed. Small marks in the dirt. Not clear footprints. Just uneven impressions like someone had paced back and forth during the night. I crouched down to study them. They didn't look like animal tracks. Too wide. Too slow. But they weren't clear enough to be human either. The edges were smudged. Like the ground had been pressed by something heavy that didn't have a proper shape. A cold feeling crept into my chest. I stood up and looked around. The shoreline was empty. The forest was still. Even the dock looked harmless in the daylight. For a moment, I thought about packing my things and leaving. Just getting back in the car and forgetting this place entirely. But then I remembered why I came here. 3 quiet weeks. No distractions. No noise. And most importantly, no people. I told myself the lights had probably been fishermen far out on the lake. The footsteps could have been an animal. Maybe a deer. Maybe something else wandering near the cabin. That explanation felt thin, but it was enough to keep me from leaving. The day passed slowly after that. I spent most of it writing at the desk near the window. The lake stayed calm all afternoon. Every now and then, I caught myself staring at the far tree line again. That same dark patch of forest where I thought I had seen movement the day before. Something about that spot bothered me. It felt deeper. Like the trees, they were hiding something. But nothing moved. By evening, the sky turned pale orange again. The same quiet settled over the lake. And with it came that strange tension I had started to recognize. The feeling that the place was waiting. I tried to ignore it. Made coffee. Opened my laptop. Forced myself to focus on writing. For a while it worked. Words filled the screen. My mind drifted into the story I was building. Then the reflection caught my eye. At first, it was just a small movement in the glass of the window. Something shifting behind me. I barely noticed it. but after a few seconds, my brain slowly registered what I was seeing. A shape, tall, standing near the center of the room, behind my chair. My fingers stopped moving on the keyboard. The reflection showed the desk, the wall, and just behind me, someone standing there, not moving, just watching, a dark human shape. My stomach dropped. I turned around immediately. The room was empty. Just the couch, the small kitchen, the closed front door. Nothing else. My breathing had gotten shallow. I waited a moment, then slowly turned back toward the window. The reflection showed only me sitting at the desk. No one behind me. I forced out a quiet laugh. Probably just my shadow, or the light changing outside. I rubbed my eyes and leaned forward again, but the uneasy feeling stayed, like the room had shifted somehow. 10 minutes passed, maybe 15. I tried writing again, but my attention kept drifting back to the glass, watching the reflection, waiting for something to move. Then it happened again. This time there was no mistake. The shape appeared clearly behind me. Tall, narrow shoulders, head slightly tilted, standing only a few feet from the back of my chair. Watching me, my entire body locked up. I stared at the reflection without blinking, trying to understand what I was seeing. The figure didn't move. It didn't breathe. It just stood there. The strange part wasn't the shape itself. It was the way it looked in the reflection. Not solid, more like a shadow pressed against the air, darker than the room around it. My heart was pounding so loud, I thought I might pass out. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head. The room behind me was empty again. No one there. The couch sat untouched. The kitchen counter was clear. Even the door was still locked. I spun back toward the window. The reflection was normal. Just me. My hands trembling on the desk. A deep wave of confusion washed over me. I stood up and walked around the cabin. Checked every corner. Opened the closet. Looked behind the couch. Nothing. No one. I even stepped outside and circled the cabin once. The gravel was undisturbed. The dock was empty. The lake was dark and still. Eventually, I came back inside, locked the door again, and sat down at the desk. My reflection stared back at me from the window. Alone. For a while, nothing happened. Then the lake lights returned. Soft white glows drifting across the water. But this time, I barely noticed them, because the reflection in the window had changed again. The figure was back, standing behind me, closer now, so close that its head almost touched mine in the glass. And this time, it wasn't looking at me. It was looking out the window, at the lake, like it was waiting for something in the water to come closer. The road disappeared behind us faster than I expected. 1 minute we were driving through open countryside, and the next the snow swallowed everything. The headlights only showed a narrow tunnel of white. Beyond that, nothing. Just thick snowfall pouring down like the sky had cracked open. Emily leaned forward in the passenger seat, staring through the windshield. "I can't even see the road anymore," she said quietly. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "It's still there," I said, even though I wasn't completely sure. The GPS had lost signal about 15 minutes ago. Now we were relying on the small wooden signs nailed to trees along the roadside. Most of them were half buried in snow. If we missed one, we'd probably end up driving straight into the forest. The tires crunched slowly over the icy gravel road. The cabin should have been close by now. At least that's what the rental email had said. 10 minutes from the main road. We had already been driving almost 20. Emily shifted in her seat. "You're sure this is the right way?" I nodded. "Pretty sure." That wasn't exactly comforting. The snow kept getting heavier. Wind pushed it sideways across the windshield, making the world outside look like a moving wall of white dust. For a moment, the headlights caught something ahead. A wooden sign, half covered in ice. I slowed the car and rolled forward until we could read it. Raven Hollow, Cabins. 1 mile. Emily exhaled slowly. Finally, I felt relief too. At least we hadn't gotten lost. We kept driving. The forest around the road grew thicker as we went deeper into the valley. Tall pines stood close together, their branches heavy with snow. Everything looked the same. White ground, dark trees, gray sky. The kind of landscape where you could drive in circles for hours without realizing it. After another few minutes, the road curved sharply to the left, and suddenly the trees opened up. 3 cabins sat in a small clearing. Or at least I thought there were 3. Snow covered most of the roofs and walls, turning them into pale shapes under the storm. A small wooden sign stood near the entrance of the clearing. Cabin 1, Cabin 2, Cabin 3. The numbers pointed in different directions. Our rental was Cabin 2. I pulled the car slowly toward the middle building. The tires slipped slightly as we stopped in front of it. For a moment, neither of us moved. The snow kept falling. Wind howled softly through the trees. Emily finally spoke. "Well, we made it." Her voice sounded half relieved, half uncertain. The cabin looked smaller than the photos online. Just a single floor with a sloped roof and a small porch. A narrow chimney stuck out of the top. No lights inside. No footprints in the snow. It looked completely abandoned. "You think the power's out?" Emily asked. "Maybe." I turned off the engine. The sudden silence inside the car felt strange after hours of driving. For a few seconds, we just sat there listening to the storm outside. Then I grabbed the keys and opened the door. Cold air rushed in immediately. The snow reached halfway up my boots as I stepped out. Emily followed behind me, pulling her jacket tighter around her neck. The wind cut through the clearing like a blade. We moved quickly toward the porch. The wooden steps groaned under the weight of the snow. I brushed a thick layer off the door handle and unlocked it. The door stuck for a moment before finally swinging open. The inside smelled like cold wood and dust, but at least it was dry. Emily stepped inside and looked around. "Not bad," she said. The cabin had 1 large room, a couch near the fireplace, a small kitchen area, a wooden table by the window. Simple but cozy. Exactly what we wanted. 3 quiet days away from the city. No work. No noise. Just snow and silence. Emily walked to the window and wiped away the frost with her sleeve. "Look at that." Outside, the storm covered everything in thick white layers. The forest beyond the clearing looked like a frozen wall. "You think the other cabins are rented?" she asked. I glanced toward the 2 buildings across the clearing. Cabin 1 sat closer to the trees. Cabin 3 farther down the slope. Both looked just as dark as ours. "No idea," I said. "Didn't see any other cars." Emily shrugged. "Maybe we're the only ones crazy enough to come here in this weather." I smiled slightly. That thought actually sounded perfect. Total isolation. Exactly what we wanted. I started unpacking the bags while Emily checked the kitchen cabinets. A few old plates. Some cups. A kettle. Nothing fancy, but it would do. Then she found the switch near the door. When she flipped it, the lights came on immediately. We both looked at each other and laughed. "Well," she said, "at least the power works." That was a relief. The fireplace probably worked too, but electricity meant we wouldn't freeze. The heater slowly hummed to life. Warm air began creeping through the cabin. Outside, the storm kept raging. Snow hit the windows in soft bursts. Emily sat down on the couch and stretched her legs. "I'm glad we came," she said. I nodded. "So am I." For the first time since the drive started, everything felt calm. Peaceful. I walked over to the window and looked outside again. The clearing had almost disappeared under the snowfall. Cabin 1 and Cabin 3 were barely visible through the white curtain. Just faint shapes in the storm. Then something caught my eye. A dark line in the snow between the cabins. At first, I thought it was a fallen branch, but the shape looked too straight. I leaned closer to the glass. The line curved slightly as it moved across the clearing. Then I realized what I was looking at. Footprints. A trail of deep impressions pressed into the fresh snow. They started near Cabin 3 and continued across the clearing toward the forest. Emily noticed me staring. "What is it?" I pointed toward the tracks. "Someone walked out there." She stood up and came to the window. We both watched the line of footprints disappear into the trees. "That's weird," she said quietly. "Maybe someone staying in the other cabin." Maybe. But something about the tracks bothered me. The snow had been falling heavily for hours. Yet the footprints looked fresh. Sharp edges, not filled in. Almost like they had been made just minutes ago. Emily stepped back from the window. "I'm making tea," she said. "Want some?" "Yeah." I stayed at the window a little longer. The forest swallowed the end of the footprints completely. No sign of who made them. No sign of them coming back. Eventually, I turned away. The warmth of the cabin was starting to spread through the room now. Emily handed me a cup of tea. The steam curled slowly into the air. Outside, the storm grew even stronger. Wind pushed snow against the walls in long whispers. For a while, we just sat there quietly, listening to the heater, watching the snow. It felt peaceful again, until Emily said something that made my stomach tighten. "Did you notice something about those footprints?" I looked at her. "What?" She hesitated for a moment. Then she said softly, "They only go one way." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Emily glanced toward the window again. "The tracks start at Cabin 3, she said, "and they go into the forest." She paused. "But there aren't any footprints coming back." The footprints were closer than I remembered. When I opened the cabin door the next morning, the cold air hit my face like a slap. The storm had calmed during the night. Snow still covered everything, but the sky above the trees had turned pale gray instead of that endless white blur from yesterday. For a moment, I just stood there on the porch. The clearing looked quiet, peaceful even. Cabin 1 and Cabin 3 sat in the same places across the snow, dark and still like they had been abandoned for years. But the ground around our cabin looked different. Emily stepped out behind me, wrapping her arms around herself. "God, it's freezing." Then she noticed what I was staring at. The snow around the cabin was covered in footprints. Not just a few. Dozens. They circled the building in a slow loop. Deep impressions pressed into the fresh snow, one after another, forming a path around the entire cabin. Emily frowned. Those weren't there last night. I stepped off the porch carefully. The snow crunched under my boots as I walked closer to the tracks. They were clear, too clear. Each print was shaped like a human foot wearing heavy boots. About my size, maybe a little bigger. The strange part wasn't the prints themselves. It was the pattern. They moved in a circle, around the cabin. Once, then twice, then a third time. Like someone had walked slowly around the walls again and again. Watching, Emily stepped down beside me. "You think someone came by last night?" I didn't answer right away. I was trying to follow the tracks, trying to find where they started, or where they ended. But the circle just kept going. Around the back of the cabin, past the windows, across the side wall, then back to the porch. Over and over. Emily whispered something under her breath. "What?" She pointed toward the snow. "Look closer." I crouched down. The prints were deep. Deep enough that whoever made them must have been heavy. But the spacing between the steps looked strange. Short, almost slow, like the person had been walking carefully, or dragging their feet. I stood up again and looked around the clearing. "Maybe someone from cabin 3, I said. Emily glanced toward the building at the far end of the clearing. Cabin 3 looked completely dark. No smoke from the chimney. No footprints near the door. Just smooth, untouched snow. "If someone walked from there," she said quietly, "there would be tracks across the clearing." I looked back at the ground. She was right. The only prints in the entire area were the ones circling our cabin. Nothing leading from cabin 3. Nothing leading back. Just the loop. My stomach tightened. Emily stepped back toward the porch. "So someone walked all the way around our cabin all night, but never left. That doesn't make sense." She didn't answer. The wind moved gently through the trees, making the branches whisper above us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Emily pointed again. "Wait." I followed her finger. The footprints continued around the back wall. But when they reached the corner of the cabin, they stopped. Just stopped. One final print pressed into the snow. Then nothing. No next step. No trail leading away. Just empty white snow beyond it. I walked to the spot slowly. The last footprint looked exactly like the others. Deep. Fresh. But the step that should have come after it simply didn't exist. Emily stood behind me, staring at the same thing. "How does that happen?" I had no answer. It looked like someone had taken a step and then vanished. Not turned. Not jumped. Just gone. Emily wrapped her arms around herself again. "I don't like this." Maybe the wind covered the rest. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. The snow here was smooth. Untouched. No disturbance at all. We both stood there in silence for a long moment. Then Emily suddenly turned toward cabin 3 again. "What if someone's inside that one? You think they came over here during the night?" "Maybe." I looked toward the building. The windows were dark. The roof was buried in snow. But from this distance, it was impossible to see much. "You want to check?" she asked. Part of me didn't. But another part felt worse, leaving the question unanswered. "Yeah," I said finally. "Let's take a look." We walked slowly across the clearing. The snow reached almost to our knees now, making every step heavy. The wind had died completely. The only sound was the crunch of our boots. When we reached cabin 3, the door looked exactly like ours had yesterday. Closed. Snow piled against the base. No footprints on the porch. I climbed the 2 wooden steps and tried the handle. Locked. Emily peered through one of the windows. I can't see anything. The glass was frosted over. Only darkness behind it. Maybe nobody rented it, I said. Emily nodded slowly. Then whose footprints were those? I didn't answer. Instead, I looked down at the snow around the porch. Still untouched. No sign anyone had come or gone. We walked back toward our cabin in silence. Halfway across the clearing, Emily suddenly stopped. What? She pointed toward the ground again. There. I followed her gaze. For a second, my brain didn't understand what I was seeing. Then the realization hit me. The footprints around our cabin had changed. The circle we saw earlier had been clean. A single path looping around the walls. But now there was something new. Another set of prints. Fresh. Walking along the same circle. Right beside the first trail. Step for step. Matching it exactly. Emily's voice came out in a whisper. Those weren't there before. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. Because she was right. These new prints were sharper. The edges crisp. Snow pushed outward where the boot had pressed down. Someone had walked around the cabin again. While we were over at cabin 3, Emily turned slowly toward our cabin. The windows looked dark from here. Silent. Empty. But the new footprints kept going. Around the back. Out of sight. Did you hear anything while we were gone? She asked. No. Neither did I. The wind stirred lightly through the clearing again. Snow slid off one of the pine branches with a soft thump. I stared at the trail leading behind our cabin. Every instinct in my body told me not to follow it. But the curiosity was stronger. Emily grabbed my arm before I could move. Wait. What? Her eyes were fixed on the ground again. This trail. What about it? She pointed carefully. Look at the direction. I leaned closer. The prints were clear now. And she was right. The first set of footprints had been walking clockwise around the cabin. But the new set was moving the opposite way. Counterclockwise. Like two people had been walking around the same building. In opposite circles. All night long. And suddenly, I realized something that made the air feel even colder. Neither set of footprints ever walked toward the door. The first knock came at exactly 3:12 in the morning. I know the time because the digital clock beside the bed lit up the dark room in dull red numbers. 3:12. The sound was soft. Just one knock. A slow, hollow tap against the cabin door. At first, I thought I had dreamed it. The kind of half sound your brain creates when you're drifting between sleep and waking. I kept lying there, listening. The heater hummed quietly through the cabin. Wind brushed snow against the windows in soft whispers. Emily slept beside me, her breathing slow and steady. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then the second knock came. Tap. This time there was no doubt. Someone was at the door. My eyes went straight to the clock again. Still 3:12. The numbers glowed like tiny warning lights in the darkness. I sat up slowly in bed. Emily stirred beside me. You hear that? I whispered. She didn't answer right away. Then her voice came out groggy. Hear what? Tap. The third knock sounded through the cabin. A little louder now. Emily sat up too. Her eyes moved toward the bedroom door. Someone's outside. I didn't answer. I was already standing. The floor felt freezing under my bare feet as I walked quietly toward the living room. The cabin was almost completely dark. Only a faint gray glow leaked through the windows from the snow outside. The door stood at the far end of the room. Silent. Still. For a moment, I wondered if the knocking had stopped. Then it came again. Tap. 3 slow knocks in a row. Whoever was outside didn't sound rushed. Didn't sound desperate. Just patient. Emily stepped out of the bedroom behind me. Who would come out here in the middle of the night? Her voice carried that tight edge people get when fear is starting to creep in. I didn't know what to say. Maybe someone from the other cabin. Maybe they needed help. But a quiet voice in the back of my mind kept reminding me of the footprints. Those endless circles in the snow. I moved closer to the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. Tap. Another knock. Right on the center of the wood. I stopped a few feet away. Hello, I called. My voice sounded strange in the quiet cabin. No answer. Emily whispered behind me. Maybe they can't hear you. Tap. The knocking continued. Same rhythm. 3 slow taps. Pause. Then silence again. I looked through the small window beside the door. Nothing. Just white snow reflecting the dim light from the sky. Do you see anyone? Emily asked. No. Maybe they stepped back. That didn't make sense. If someone had stepped back, their footprints would still be there, pressed deep into the snow. But something inside me already knew what we would see. Or what we wouldn't. The knocking came again. Tap, tap, tap. Still calm. Still patient. Like whoever stood outside had all the time in the world. Emily wrapped her arms around herself. You should open it. The words hung in the air for a second. Part of me agreed. If someone really needed help out there in the cold, we couldn't just ignore them. But another part of me didn't want to touch that door. Not yet. Instead, I reached for the porch light switch beside the frame. The light flicked on with a dull buzz. The snow outside the door brightened instantly. I leaned toward the window again. Still nothing. No person. No shadow. Just the empty porch covered in fresh snow. Emily frowned. That's impossible. The knocking stopped. Just like that. The sudden silence felt heavier than the sound itself. We both stood there listening. The heater hummed. The wind whispered through the trees. But the door stayed quiet. I waited another minute before unlocking it. Emily grabbed my arm. Are you sure? I nodded slowly. Then I pulled the door open. Cold air rushed into the cabin. The porch light spilled across the snow outside. The clearing looked exactly like it had before. White, still, empty. No one stood on the porch. No one walked away. The snow remained perfectly smooth. Not a single footprint. Emily stepped beside me and looked down. Her voice came out almost as a whisper. There's nothing. I stared at the ground. She was right. The snow on the porch was untouched. No marks. No tracks. No sign anyone had stood there. But the knocking had been real. We both heard it. 3 times. I slowly closed the door again. The lock clicked softly. For a while, neither of us moved. Emily finally spoke. What if it's the same person who made those footprints? But how would they get here without leaving tracks? She didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer. Eventually, we went back to bed. Neither of us slept much after that. The night stretched on slowly. Every sound made my body tense. Branches cracking in the forest. Snow sliding off the roof. Wind brushing the walls. I kept staring at the clock beside the bed, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Morning finally arrived like a gray blur through the windows. The storm had stopped completely. Sunlight reflected off the snow, making the clearing almost painfully bright. We stepped outside together. The first thing I looked at was the porch. The snow was exactly the same as it had been during the night. Smooth, untouched. Emily walked down the steps and looked around the cabin. No footprints anywhere. Not even the circles from yesterday. The fresh snowfall had buried everything. The clearing looked like a blank page. For a moment, I felt relief. Maybe the storm had just played tricks on us. Maybe the knocking had been something hitting the wall. A loose branch, or ice sliding off the roof. Emily suddenly spoke from behind me. "Wait." Her voice sounded tight again. I turned. She stood near the edge of the porch, staring down at something in the snow. "What is it?" She didn't answer. She just stepped aside so I could see. At first, I didn't notice anything strange. Just smooth white snow. Then I saw it. 3 small dents in the snow. Right in front of the door. Perfectly spaced. Tap, tap, tap. The marks looked shallow, like someone had knocked on the snow itself. From the outside, exactly 3 times. And when I looked up at the cabin door again, I realized something that made my chest tighten. The wood was scratched. 3 faint lines near the center, right where the knocking had come from. And they were placed at a height that was far too low for a standing person. Almost like whoever knocked on our door that night was crouching. The first thing I noticed about Firewatch Cabin 12 was how quiet the forest felt. Not peaceful quiet. Empty quiet. The kind of silence that makes you feel like the woods are holding their breath. I stood there with my backpack in the dirt road, staring up at the tower. The cabin sat on tall wooden legs about 30 feet above the ground, leaning slightly like it had been pushed by too many winters. Most of the other Firewatch towers in the region had been replaced years ago. But this one was still standing. Barely. The truck that dropped me off had already disappeared down the road. The sound of its engine faded quickly through the trees until the forest swallowed it completely. And just like that, I was alone. 3 months in the mountains. That was the job. Watch for smoke. Report any fires. Keep the radio on. It sounded simple enough. At least it did when I signed the contract. But now that I was actually here, standing at the bottom of the tower with the wind moving slowly through the pines, something about the place felt wrong. The stairs creaked under my boots as I started climbing. Each step echoed through the wood. The climb felt longer than it should have. Halfway up, I stopped and looked out across the valley. Nothing but trees. Endless rows of dark green stretching over the mountains. No houses. No roads. Just forest. That was the point of the job. Isolation. Some people hated it. I didn't mind. After the year I'd had, quiet sounded pretty good. The door at the top of the tower stuck a little when I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust. A small desk sat by the window with an old radio set on top. There was a narrow bed against the far wall. A metal stove. A shelf with a few canned foods someone had left behind. Simple, but it would do. The windows wrapped around the entire cabin, giving a full view of the mountains in every direction. That part was beautiful. Clouds drifted slowly between the peaks. Sunlight broke through the branches in long gold streaks. From up here, the forest looked calm, almost peaceful, but that strange, quiet feeling was still there, like something was missing. I set my bag down and walked to the radio. The old speaker crackled softly when I flipped the switch. Static filled the cabin. Then a voice pushed through the noise. Station 12, radio check. The voice sounded distant. Calm. I picked up the microphone. This is 12, loud and clear. A short pause. Welcome to the mountain, the voice replied. It was the main ranger station down in the valley, probably 10 miles away. You're the only tower active on this ridge, the voice continued. Just keep an eye out for smoke. Weather should stay clear this week. Copy that. Another pause followed. Then the voice added something strange. If the radio acts up, don't worry about it. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Old equipment, he said quickly. Cabin 12 been empty for a while. How long? The radio crackled again. A few seasons. That didn't answer the question. But before I could ask anything else, the voice spoke again. Check in every evening around sunset. Got it. The radio clicked off. The static faded. Silence returned to the cabin. I set the microphone down slowly. Something about that conversation bothered me. The way he said the tower had been empty, like he was leaving something out. I walked to the window and looked down at the forest below. The wind moved through the trees in slow waves. A hawk circled somewhere far above the ridge. Everything looked normal. Still, that quiet feeling wouldn't go away. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking. Food on the shelf. Sleeping bag on the bed. Notebook on the desk. By evening, the cabin started to feel a little more like home. The sunset over the mountains was incredible. The sky turned orange and purple behind the trees, and shadows stretched across the valley like long fingers. Right on schedule, I turned on the radio again. This is Station 12, I said. Evening check. The response came almost instantly. Copy that. Same voice as before. All clear up there. Clear. We exchanged a few routine details. Weather. Visibility. Nothing unusual. Then I hesitated. Hey, I said, quick question. Go ahead. You said this tower's been empty for a few seasons. Yeah. Why? The radio went quiet for a moment. Long enough that I thought the signal might have dropped. Then the ranger finally spoke again. Just staffing issues. His tone sounded different now. Shorter. Less friendly. You'll be fine up there, he added. Before I could respond, the line went dead. The cabin filled with silence again. Outside, the last light of the sun disappeared behind the mountains. Darkness moved quickly through the forest. Within minutes, the trees below turned into a black ocean of shadows. I lit the small lamp on the desk. The warm glow made the cabin feel smaller. Safer. For a while, I wrote in my notebook. Just random thoughts. Trying to get used to the quiet. Around midnight, I finally shut the lamp off and lay down on the bed. The wind picked up outside. The tower creaked softly as it swayed. Old wood adjusting to the night. It didn't bother me. I'd slept in worse places before. Eventually, my eyes started to close. Sleep crept in slowly. And then something woke me up. A sound. Faint. I opened my eyes and looked toward the dark windows. For a second, I thought it had been the wind. But the sound came again. Very soft. A crackling whisper. Like a voice buried inside static. My heart started beating faster. Because the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from the radio. The speaker glowed faintly in the dark. Static hissed quietly from it. Then the voice came through. Broken. Barely understandable. Hello. I sat up slowly. The radio wasn't supposed to be on. I had switched it off before going to bed. Anyone there? The words dragged through the static like something struggling to breathe. I reached for the microphone. "This is Station 12, I said carefully. "Who's calling?" The radio fell silent. Only static remained. For a moment, I thought the transmission had ended. Then the voice returned. But this time it sounded closer, clearer, and the words it said made the back of my neck go cold. "You're not supposed to be in that cabin." The first night it happened, I thought the radio was broken. It started with a thin scratch of static. Just a faint hiss crawling through the speaker beside my bed. The kind of sound that usually means a loose wire or bad weather interference. I opened one eye and stared at the clock. 2:17 a.m. My cabin was silent except for the wind rubbing the trees together outside, pine branches scraping softly like dry fingers. Then the radio crackled again. Longer this time. I sighed and rolled out of bed. Cabin 12 was old, older than most of the towers still standing in the park. The wood floors creaked under my feet as I walked across the room. My flashlight beam slid over the walls, over the small desk, the dusty maps pinned beside the window. The radio sat where it always did. Black, square, quiet. I tapped it once. The static stopped. For a second. Then it came back louder. "Great," I muttered. The last ranger must have left it half broken. I leaned closer and turned the dial slowly. Nothing but static. Different shades of it. Some soft, some sharp, like rain on metal. Then something strange happened. The static changed. Not louder. Not quieter. Just different. Like something was moving inside it. I frowned and leaned closer. And that's when I heard it. A voice. So faint I almost missed it. "Hello." I froze. The word slipped through the static like a breath through cracked glass. I turned the volume knob slowly. The static swelled. But the voice didn't come back. Just endless white noise. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. Nothing. I rubbed my face and laughed under my breath. "Sleep deprivation," I said quietly. My first week up here had already messed with my sleep. Too quiet, too dark, too far from everything. Your brain starts inventing things. I switched the radio off. The silence returned instantly. But as I turned away, something in my chest felt tight. Because I was almost sure that voice had said hello. Not help. Not noise. Hello. Like someone trying to reach someone. I stood there a moment longer. Then I went back to bed. But I didn't sleep much after that. The second night, the radio turned on by itself. I woke to the same sound. Static. Only this time it was louder. And closer. My eyes snapped open. The room glowed faintly from the moonlight outside the tower windows. The radio light was on. I sat up slowly. I was sure I'd switched it off. The static hissed softly across the room. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I got up again. The floor creaked under my weight. I walked over and checked the switch. Still off. My stomach tightened. The radio was clearly on. But the power toggle hadn't moved. I stared at it confused. Maybe the wiring inside was shorting out. Old equipment does weird things in cold weather. I leaned down toward the speaker. "Hello," I said. The static kept flowing. Then suddenly, "Can you hear me?" The voice was clearer this time. Still faint. Still buried under the hiss. But unmistakably human. My heart kicked hard in my chest. "Yeah," I said quickly. "I hear you. Who is this?" No answer. Just static. Then again. Please. The word stretched thin across the signal, like someone whispering from a long distance. My throat felt dry. This is Ranger Station Cabin 12, I said. Who's calling? The static surged again. For a moment, I thought the signal had died. Then the voice returned. Don't let him. The transmission cut off. Dead silence. I stared at the speaker. Hello, I said again. Nothing. Just the low hum of the radio circuitry. The forest outside groaned in the wind. I waited another minute. 2 minutes. Still nothing. Finally, I shut the radio off. For real this time. And I sat there staring at it. Because something about that message didn't sit right. Not the voice. Not the words. Something else. Something small. Something my brain didn't catch until later. The voice sounded wrong. Not distorted. Not mechanical. Just old. Like a recording played through dust. The next morning I hiked down to the supply shed, where the main ranger station kept extra gear. Tom was there. He'd been working these mountains almost 20 years. If anyone knew the radios, it was him. I set the unit down on the counter. This thing acting weird, he asked. Maybe, I said. Picked up some strange transmissions last night. Tom popped the back panel open. His flashlight beam slid across the wiring. All looks normal, he said. Could it be picking up another tower? He shrugged. Sometimes hikers carry walkies. Weather bounces signals around too. I hesitated. The voice sounded strange. Tom didn't look up. How strange. I thought about it, then shook my head. Hard to explain. He closed the radio and pushed it back toward me. Well, Cabin 12's way out there. You might catch signals from old Ranger towers. Some aren't even active anymore. Old towers? Yeah, a few shut down decades ago. He smiled. Radio waves bounce around the mountains like ghosts sometimes. Ghosts? The word stuck with me longer than it should have. I carried the radio back up the trail that afternoon. The forest felt different on the hike back. Quieter, like it was waiting. The third night was when things changed. I didn't wake up this time. I was already awake, sitting by the window, watching fog roll slowly through the trees below the tower. The radio sat silent on the desk beside me. For hours, nothing, no static, no voices. I started to believe the whole thing had been imagination. Then the speaker clicked. A soft mechanical pop. The static returned instantly. But this time it wasn't random. It pulsed, like breathing. My skin prickled. I slowly turned toward the radio. Hello. The voice came again. Clearer now. Closer. I leaned forward. Who is this? I asked quietly. Static filled the room. Then the voice whispered something that made my stomach drop. You're in my tower. A long pause followed. The wind outside pushed against the wooden walls. My heart thudded louder than the radio. What tower? I said. The reply came slowly, like the speaker was struggling to push the words out. Firewatch Cabin 12. I felt cold all over, because that was exactly where I was sitting. I grabbed the microphone. Listen, I said quickly. I'm the new ranger here. Who is this? Static swelled violently. The voice came again, but this time it sounded afraid. He's coming back. A sharp burst of noise ripped through the speaker. I winced. Then the whisper returned. You shouldn't be here. My chest tightened. Who's coming back? I asked. No response. Just static. Loud now. Angry. Like the mountains themselves were screaming through the wire. Then suddenly, another voice broke through. Deeper. Clearer. And much closer. Who are you talking to? The question wasn't directed at me. It sounded like someone standing beside the first speaker. My blood ran cold, because the first voice whispered something in reply, something the radio barely carried through the noise. But I heard it. Him. The radio went completely silent. Not even static. Just dead air. I sat frozen in the chair. The fog outside the tower had thickened, swallowing the trees, swallowing the trail, swallowing everything. And in that silence, one thought kept repeating in my head. If that voice belonged to someone in this tower, then where were they speaking from? The trail wasn't there the day before. I know that for a fact. I had walked that ridge 3 times already that week. Same route every morning. Cabin 12 down the narrow switchback, past the leaning pine, across the shallow creek, then up along the western slope. Routine keeps you sane out here. Same path. Same trees. Same rocks. But that morning, something had changed. I noticed it halfway up the ridge. At first, it just looked like a break in the brush. A narrow gap between 2 thick patches of ferns. I almost walked past it. Then I saw the ground. The dirt was pressed down, like people had been walking there. Recently, I stopped. The wind moved slowly through the tall pines above me. Their branches whispered against each other in long, dry sighs. I stood there staring at the gap, because I knew this ridge. There was no trail here. I crouched down and touched the dirt. Soft, loose, fresh footprints had passed through. Not animal tracks. Human. My chest tightened a little. That didn't make sense. Cabin 12 sat deep in the backcountry. No marked trails came this far west except the one I had just climbed. No hikers should have been out here. I stood slowly and looked deeper into the brush. The trail curved gently downhill. Thin, almost hidden, but definitely real. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, just finishing my patrol and reporting it later. But curiosity has a way of pulling you forward out here, especially when you're alone. I stepped into the gap. The forest changed immediately. The trees grew closer together, thicker. Their branches blocked most of the sky. Sunlight barely reached the ground, turning the trail into a dim tunnel of shadow and moss. The air felt colder too. Not freezing, just still. I walked slowly, each step careful. The dirt path twisted through the trees like it had been there for years. But that made it even stranger. If this trail existed, it should have been on the ranger maps. Every path in these mountains had been documented decades ago. Every one, except this one. The deeper I walked, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no insects, just the soft crunch of my boots and the distant groan of wind moving through the higher branches. After about 10 minutes, the trail widened slightly. I stopped again. Something caught my eye on the ground. A boot print, clear as day. I knelt beside it. The tread pattern was old-fashioned, not like modern hiking boots. The edges looked worn down, almost smooth. I pressed my hand next to it. The print was bigger than my boot, and deeper, like whoever made it had been carrying weight. I stood again and followed the trail. My curiosity was turning into something else now. Unease, a quiet feeling crawling up my spine, because the trail kept going, and going, and going, longer than it should have. Then I saw it. At first it looked like another shadow between the trees, a darker shape against the forest. I slowed my steps. The trail ended in a clearing, and in the middle of that clearing stood a cabin. Not a small one, a firewatch cabin. My heart skipped. The structure looked almost identical to cabin 12. Tall wooden legs lifting the square room above the ground. A narrow staircase climbing up the front. Wide windows wrapping around the top. But the wood was darker, older, weathered almost black by time. I stood at the edge of the clearing staring at it. My mind immediately reached for the maps I had studied. Every tower in this district was marked. Every one. Except this one. The wind brushed through the clearing. The cabin creaked softly in response, like it had been waiting there a very long time. I stepped closer. The grass around the tower was flattened in places. More footprints. Some fresh, some old. A cold feeling spread across my shoulders. Someone had definitely been here. Recently. I approached the staircase slowly. Each wooden step groaned as I climbed. The sound echoed too loudly in the quiet forest. Halfway up, I paused. The front door of the cabin was slightly open. Just an inch. A thin slice of darkness inside. I stared at that gap for several seconds. My brain tried to explain it away. Maybe another ranger used this tower years ago. Maybe it had just been forgotten in the records. But something about the place felt wrong. Not abandoned. Not empty. Just paused. Like a room someone had left only minutes ago. I pushed the door open slowly. It creaked wide. Dust floated through the air inside. The interior looked exactly like cabin 12. Same desk. Same radio table. Same old stove in the corner. But everything was covered in a thick gray layer of dust. Like it hadn't been touched in decades. My boots left clear tracks on the floorboards as I stepped inside. The windows were cloudy with age, but enough light pushed through to see the room clearly. That's when I noticed something on the desk. A logbook. I walked toward it slowly. The cover was cracked leather. The pages yellowed with time. I opened it carefully. The first few pages listed daily fire reports. Dates. Weather conditions. Routine entries. Then I noticed the year. My breath caught slightly. The entries continued for weeks. Same handwriting. Same ranger signature. Until suddenly they changed. The writing became rushed. Messy. Like the person had been in a hurry. One entry caught my eye. July 12. Radio interference again tonight. Voice keeps calling from cabin 12, but that tower was shut down years ago. My stomach dropped. I flipped the page. Another entry. July 15. Heard footsteps outside after midnight. No lights in the forest. No response when I called out. The room felt colder suddenly. I turned another page. July 18. I checked the maps again. The trail to this tower shouldn't exist anymore. My fingers froze on the paper. The trail. The one I had just walked. I slowly looked around the cabin again. Every piece of furniture looked untouched. But the logbook said someone had been here. Watching. Listening. Waiting. My chest tightened. Because I realized something else. The ranger writing these entries had been hearing radio calls from cabin 12. The same cabin I was living in now. I flipped to the final page. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, like the pen had been shaking. July 21. He found the trail. A chill ran down my spine. I kept reading. He's using the radio now. He knows I'm here. The sentence stopped abruptly. The rest of the page was blank. The cabin creaked softly above me. I slowly closed the logbook. And that's when I heard it. A faint sound. Very far away. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then it came again. Static. My blood went cold. Because the sound wasn't coming from the forest. It was coming from the radio sitting on the desk behind me. I turned slowly. The radio light flickered weakly. Dust covered the entire machine, except one small spot on the switch, where the dust had been disturbed, like someone had touched it recently. The speaker crackled softly. Static filled the silent cabin. Then a whisper pushed through the noise. You followed the trail. I felt my throat tighten. The voice sounded familiar. The same one from my radio at cabin 12. The speaker crackled again. He knows now. My heart pounded harder. Who knows? I asked quietly. The radio hissed. Then the whisper returned. Closer this time. The other ranger. The cabin groaned in the wind. The voice lowered to almost nothing. He's coming up the stairs. My blood froze. Because beneath the floorboards, I heard a slow wooden creak. One step, then another, climbing toward the door. The footsteps stopped halfway up the stairs. Just stopped. The wood beneath the cabin settled again, creaking softly as the wind moved through the trees. But the steps I'd heard were different. Slow, heavy, human. I stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at the door. The radio behind me crackled once more. Don't move. The whisper barely pushed through the static. I didn't. My eyes stayed locked on the doorway. The door itself was still open from when I walked in, hanging crooked on its hinges. Nothing stood there. No shadow. No hand on the railing. Just the empty staircase leading down into the trees. I waited. My breathing slowed. My ears strained to hear anything outside. Nothing came. The forest below the tower looked perfectly still. A strange calm settled in my chest. Not relief, just a quiet confusion. Had I imagined the steps? Sleep deprivation does strange things out here. Too many silent nights. Too much time alone with your thoughts. I exhaled slowly. Okay, I whispered to myself. The radio hummed softly. He's listening. The voice sounded weaker now, like someone talking through thick walls. I turned toward the desk again. What do you mean? I asked quietly. Static swallowed the speaker. No answer. Just that endless hiss. I stared at the radio for a moment longer before finally stepping away. The cabin felt smaller now, the air thicker. My eyes began moving across the room more carefully. That's when I noticed the first photograph. It sat on a small shelf beside the window. Face down, half buried under dust. I walked over slowly and picked it up. The paper felt old and stiff. I flipped it over. My stomach tightened. The photo showed a man standing beside a ranger truck near the base trailhead. The truck door was open. The mountains stretched behind him. The man looked tired but calm. He wore a Forest Service jacket. And the face in the picture was mine. I stared at it for several seconds. The photo had been taken from a distance, like someone standing across the parking lot. I remembered that day. It was the morning I arrived for the job. I had parked the truck and stepped out to stretch my legs. But I had been alone. Or at least I thought I was. A cold weight settled in my chest. I slowly turned the photo over. Nothing written on the back. Just yellowed paper. I set it down carefully. Then I noticed something else. another photograph pinned to the wall beside the desk. I stepped closer. This one showed the ranger station supply shed. Tom stood outside, talking to someone just out of frame. The photo was taken from behind a tree, far away. Watching, my pulse quickened, because I remembered that moment too. It had happened 2 days ago, when I dropped off the radio. I scanned the walls, and suddenly I saw them everywhere. Photographs, dozens of them. Some pinned, some taped, some simply stacked on shelves. Every single one showing me, walking along the ridge trail, standing outside cabin 12, climbing the lookout stairs, sleeping through the tower window at night. My chest tightened as I moved closer to the wall. The photos were taken from different angles, different distances, some from behind trees, some from far across clearings. Someone had been watching me since the moment I arrived. But that wasn't the part that scared me the most. I picked up one of the older photographs. The edges were curled with age. The image showed me standing on the porch of cabin 12, looking out over the forest at sunset. But something felt wrong about it. I looked closer. The jacket I wore in the photo wasn't the one I owned. The truck in the background wasn't the same model either. I flipped the picture over. The date was written on the back in faded ink. June 3, 1987. My stomach twisted. That couldn't be right. I hadn't even been born yet. My hands felt cold holding the picture. I grabbed another one. Another. More dates. All showing the same man. My face. My body. Walking the same trails. Standing in the same tower. Living the same routine I had just started weeks ago. My thoughts began racing. That was impossible. These photos had to belong to someone else. Someone who looked like me. But the more I studied them, the more certain I became. The scars on my hand. The small bend in my nose from an old break. Even the way I stood. It was all identical. The cabin creaked softly. I slowly turned my head toward the radio. It crackled again. Now you see. My voice came out dry. Who took these? The static hissed louder. Then the whisper returned. He did. A long pause filled the room. The ranger. My throat tightened. The one from the logbook. Static surged briefly. Yes. I looked back at the photographs covering the walls. But why? I asked. The radio fell silent for a long moment. Then the voice returned, slower this time. Because you always come back. My chest felt hollow. What do you mean? The wind pushed against the cabin walls. The boards groaned. The whisper drifted through the speaker again. You always find the trail. I stared at the photo in my hand. You always take the tower. My heart pounded louder now. And he always finds you. A cold chill slid through my spine. Who finds me? For a long moment, the radio gave no answer. Then the speaker clicked softly. The voice that came through next wasn't the same one. It was deeper, calmer, older. I do. Every muscle in my body locked. The voice continued. You shouldn't have followed the trail again. My eyes slowly moved toward the door. The staircase outside remained empty. But the forest below looked darker now. The fog had rolled in while I was inside. Thick, heavy, swallowing the clearing. The voice came again through the radio. You always get curious. My throat felt tight. Who are you? The answer came immediately. The ranger who lives here. I shook my head slowly. That's impossible. The speaker crackled. You said that last time too. The wind pressed harder against the tower walls. The cabin groaned softly. Then the voice spoke again. Check the mirror. I hesitated. There was a small mirror hanging beside the stove. Old, cloudy glass. My feet moved toward it before my brain could stop them. I stood in front of the mirror and looked up. For a moment, I just saw myself. My tired eyes. My dust-covered jacket. Then I noticed something strange. A shadow behind me. My stomach dropped. Because in the reflection, someone was standing in the doorway behind me. Tall, still, watching. I spun around. The doorway was empty. No one there. My heart slammed against my ribs. I slowly turned back toward the mirror. The reflection showed the room behind me again. But now the doorway was empty there too. The radio crackled softly. You're starting to remember. My hands trembled slightly. Remember what? The whisper returned. How this ends. The cabin creaked again. Outside, the fog pressed closer around the tower. Thick enough now that I could barely see the trees. The radio spoke one last time. Because once he reaches cabin 12. A long pause followed. The static grew louder. You disappear again. The first thing I noticed about cabin 7 was that nobody looked at it. Not the campers. Not the other counselors. Not even the maintenance staff. It sat at the far edge of the summer camp, half hidden behind a row of tall pine trees. The paint had peeled away years ago, leaving the wood underneath gray and cracked. One of the windows was boarded shut. And every time someone walked past it, they turned their head the other way. I noticed that on my first day. Orientation had just ended. The sun was high, kids were running around the field, and counselors were leading groups toward the cabins. Normal summer camp chaos. But when we reached the path that led past cabin 7, something changed. The chatter got quieter. People walked faster. One of the younger campers pointed at the building. Is that where we're sleeping? The counselor beside him quickly shook her head. Nope, that one's closed. Her voice had that fake cheerful tone adults use when they don't want to explain something. The kid squinted at the cabin again. Why? She didn't answer. Instead, she gently turned the group toward the next row of cabins. Come on, guys, keep moving. I slowed down slightly as we passed. Cabin 7 stood maybe 20 feet off the path. A crooked wooden sign still hung above the door, barely readable through years of dirt. The door itself had a thick metal chain wrapped around the handle. A large padlock held it in place. Someone had nailed 2 wooden boards across the front window. But the boards didn't cover it completely. A thin strip of glass was still visible between them. Dark inside. Completely black. For a second, I thought I saw something move behind the glass. Just a small shift. Like someone stepping away from the window. I blinked. The glass showed nothing but darkness again. Hey! A voice behind me made me jump slightly. It was Mark, the senior counselor for our group. Tall guy, mid-20s, wore the same camp staff shirt as the rest of us. He nodded toward the path. Orientation, that way. I glanced back at cabin 7. Yeah, I was just looking. Mark followed my gaze. For a second, his expression tightened. Then he forced a casual smile. Don't worry about that one. Why's it closed? He scratched the back of his neck. Old building, structural problems. Something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. Like he had given that answer before. I looked at the boarded window again. Looks like someone really didn't want people going in. Mark's smile faded slightly. That's kind of the point. He turned and started walking. Camp rule, he added over his shoulder. Nobody goes near cabin 7. I followed him down the path, but I kept glancing back at the building, because something about it didn't feel abandoned. It felt watched. That night, the campfire stories started. Every summer camp has them. Ghost stories, local legends, things told in low voices once the sun goes down. Our group sat in a wide circle near the lake. The fire crackled softly while sparks floated up into the dark sky. The campers leaned forward, excited and nervous. One of the older counselors, Jess, started telling a story about the woods behind the camp. Something about hikers hearing footsteps at night. The kids loved it. But halfway through the story, one of the campers raised his hand. What about cabin 7? The circle got quiet. Jess stopped talking mid-sentence. Several counselors exchanged quick looks. The kid pointed toward the dark trees. I saw it today. Why is it closed? For a moment, nobody answered. Then Mark leaned forward slightly. It's just an old building, he said calmly. Then why's it locked? Another pause. Jess poked the fire with a stick. It used to be a girl's cabin, she said. Years ago. The campers leaned closer. What happened? One asked. Jess hesitated. Then she sighed. There was an accident. The word hung in the air. What kind of accident? Another kid asked. Jess glanced toward Mark again. He gave a small shrug. She looked back at the campers. One summer, a counselor went missing. The fire popped loudly. Several kids jumped. They searched the whole camp, Jess continued. The woods, the lake, everywhere. Did they find her? Jess shook her head slowly. No. The campers shifted uncomfortably. After that, she said, the camp shut down cabin 7. A younger boy frowned. But why? Jess stared into the fire for a moment before answering. Because the last place anyone saw her, she pointed toward the dark line of trees, was inside that cabin. The circle went quiet again. The lake behind us rippled softly in the wind. One camper whispered, "Is it haunted?" Jess gave a small laugh. No, but the way she said it didn't sound convincing. Mark stood up and clapped his hands. All right, ghost stories are done for tonight. The campers groaned, but they slowly stood and started heading toward their cabins. I stayed by the fire a moment longer, watching the flames burn down. Jess walked past me carrying a box of marshmallow sticks. You okay? She asked. Yeah, I said. Then I nodded toward the woods. You believe that story? Jess shrugged. I believe the camp doesn't want people talking about it. Why not? She paused, then lowered her voice slightly. Because the weird part is that someone disappeared. My curiosity sharpened. What's the weird part? Jess looked back toward the cabins, then leaned closer. The weird part, she whispered, is that someone keeps opening cabin 7. My stomach tightened. But it's locked, I said. Exactly. Jess gave a small, uneasy smile. Maintenance chains it shut every year before camp starts. And every couple weeks, someone finds the door open again. The fire popped again. A gust of wind pushed smoke through the trees. Maybe someone has a key, I suggested. Jess shook her head slowly. The lock never breaks. I frowned. Then how does it open? Jess didn't answer right away. She just stared at the dark forest where cabin 7 stood hidden between the trees. Then she said something very quietly. From the inside, a chill ran across my shoulders. I forced a laugh. That doesn't make sense. Jess nodded. I know. She picked up the last of the supplies and started walking toward the cabins. Then she stopped, turned back toward me. One more thing. What? Her voice dropped lower. The counselor who disappeared. The wind rustled the leaves above us. She was the one assigned to cabin 7. Jess walked away after that, leaving me alone beside the dying fire. The forest around the camp had grown completely dark now. The path lights barely reached the trees. And somewhere out there, past the line of cabins, cabin 7 sat quietly in the woods. Locked, boarded, closed for years. But as I stood up to leave, I noticed something strange. Far through the trees, just barely visible between the branches, a small light flickered inside the cabin window, like someone had just turned on a flashlight. The light was gone when I looked again. Just darkness behind the boards. I stood there at the edge of the path for a long moment, staring through the trees. The wind moved slowly through the branches, making the pine needles whisper together. No light, no movement, just the old cabin sitting there like it always had. I rubbed my eyes. Maybe it had been a reflection from the campfire, or someone walking with a flashlight farther down the trail. That made more sense. It had to. Still, something about the way the light moved kept bothering me. It hadn't looked like a flashlight. It had looked like a lantern. A slow, warm glow. Like someone walking around inside the cabin. I forced myself to turn away. The path lights led back toward the counselor's cabins. Most of the campers were already asleep by the time I got back. The whole camp had that quiet nighttime feeling. Crickets chirping, wind brushing through the lake grass, someone laughing quietly in the distance. Normal. Everything felt normal again. Almost. Except I couldn't stop thinking about that light. The next night I saw it again. I wasn't even looking for it. Our group had just finished dinner and the campers were heading toward the rec hall for a movie night. I walked behind them, making sure nobody wandered off the path. Halfway there, I glanced toward the trees. And there it was. A faint orange glow shining through the narrow gap in the boards covering cabin 7's window. My steps slowed. The campers kept walking ahead, laughing and shoving each other. But I stayed near the edge of the path, watching the cabin. The light flickered slightly. Soft, uneven, definitely not a flashlight. It looked exactly like a lantern flame. My chest tightened, because the door was still chained shut. I had passed it earlier that day. The padlock was still there. The boards were still nailed across the glass. So how could someone be inside? I waited. The glow moved slowly across the window, like someone walking from one side of the cabin to the other. Then it stopped, right in the middle of the window, like whoever was holding it had paused. My throat felt dry. For a second I wondered if the person inside could see me standing there. A camper called my name from the path. Hey, movie's starting. I turned toward them. Coming, I said. But when I looked back at the cabin again, the light had disappeared. I didn't tell anyone that night. I kept thinking there had to be a normal explanation. Maybe maintenance workers used the cabin for storage. Maybe someone had a key. But the next day, I checked the door again. The chain hadn't moved. The padlock still hung tight against the handle. Dust covered the boards on the window. No footprints in the dirt around the porch. It looked exactly like it had the day I arrived. Closed. Abandoned. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to see through the thin strip of uncovered glass. The inside looked completely dark. Empty. Then a voice behind me made me jump. You're not supposed to be here. I turned quickly. Mark stood a few steps down the path. His arms crossed. He wasn't smiling this time. I was just checking it out, I said. Mark walked closer. His eyes moved from me to the cabin door, then back to me again. Camp rule, he said quietly. Nobody goes near cabin 7. Why not? Mark sighed. You heard the story. Yeah, I said, but that doesn't explain the light. His face went still. What light? I hesitated. Inside the cabin. Mark stared at me for several seconds. Then he shook his head. There's no light in there. I saw it. When? Last night. His jaw tightened slightly. That's not possible. I know what I saw. Mark stepped past me and looked up at the window boards. The strip of exposed glass reflected the afternoon sunlight. Nothing else. After a moment, he turned back toward me. Listen, he said. His voice was lower now. Sometimes the trees reflect camp lights at night, makes it look like something moving in the woods. That's not what this was. Mark held my gaze. Then he said something strange. If you see it again, don't look at it. I frowned. What? Just ignore it. That doesn't make sense. Mark started walking back toward the path. Trust me, he said. I watched him leave. Then I looked back at the cabin window one more time. The glass stared back at me. Dark. Empty. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside had been watching our entire conversation. The third night was the worst, because the light didn't just appear once. It kept appearing. I was sitting outside the counselor's cabin with Jess after lights out. We were keeping watch while the campers slept. The forest around the camp had grown quiet. No wind. No voices. Just the lake water moving softly against the shore. Then Jess nudged my arm. You see that? I followed her gaze toward the trees. The glow flickered between the branches. Cabin 7 again. The lantern light was stronger tonight, bright enough that we could clearly see it through the boards. Jess leaned forward. That's weird. You see it too? I asked. Yeah. She squinted at the cabin. Maintenance shouldn't be working this late. The glow moved slowly across the window again, back and forth, like someone packing inside the room. Jess stood up. I'm gonna check it out. I grabbed her arm quickly. Wait. She looked down at me. What? I hesitated. Then I remembered what Mark had said. If you see it again, don't look at it. Maybe we should leave it alone, I said. Jess frowned. Why? Before I could answer, the light stopped moving, right in the center of the window. Then it grew brighter, slowly, like the lantern had been lifted higher. Jess took a small step forward. The glow pressed against the strip of exposed glass, warm orange light leaking through the boards. And then we both saw something move behind it. A shape, tall, human, standing directly behind the window. My chest tightened, because the silhouette didn't look like someone holding a lantern. It looked like someone holding it up to look out. Right at us. Jess whispered, "Is someone in there?" The shadow didn't move. The lantern stayed raised, shining straight through the boards, right where we stood. Then something changed. The glow shifted slightly, and for a split second, the light passed across the inside wall of the cabin, just long enough for me to see something written there. Large letters scratched into the wood, over and over again. Help me, help me, Help me. The lantern suddenly went dark. The window became black again. Jess and I stood frozen in the night air. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then, very slowly, the metal chain on cabin 7's door began to rattle. Nobody mentioned the missing camper during the day. Not in front of the kids. Not during activities. Not even during staff meetings. But once the campers were asleep, the stories started leaking out. It happened 3 nights after Jess and I saw the lantern. Neither of us talked about what we saw. At least not out loud. But I could tell it was sitting in both our heads. Every time we walked past the trail toward cabin 7, we looked at the window. Every time. And every night after that, the lantern came back. Sometimes faint. Sometimes brighter. Always moving. Always packing behind the boards. Like someone trapped inside. Or someone waiting. That night the counselors gathered in the staff kitchen after lights out. Old wooden building, dim yellow lights, smelled like coffee and burnt popcorn. A few of us sat around the table while Mark filled out paperwork at the counter. Nobody talked about cabin 7 at first. We just complained about the campers. Normal stuff. Until one of the older staff members spoke up. Her name was Linda. She'd been working at the camp longer than anyone. Probably late 40s, calm voice, the kind of person who knew every corner of the place. She leaned back in her chair and looked at Jess. You two were near the old trail tonight, right? Jess stiffened slightly. Yeah. Linda nodded slowly. You see anything strange? The room got quiet. Jess glanced at me. Then back at Linda. Why do you ask? Linda tapped her fingers on the table. Because every few summers, someone sees a light in cabin 7. A small chill ran through the room. One of the younger counselors laughed nervously. Maintenance guys probably messing around. Linda didn't smile. No maintenance staff goes near that cabin after dark. Mark looked up from the counter. Linda. His tone carried a warning. But she kept talking. You two know the story about the missing counselor, she said. Jess nodded. Yeah. Linda leaned forward slightly. But that's not the whole story. Something in my chest tightened. What do you mean? I asked. Linda studied my face for a moment, like she was deciding how much to say. Then she sighed. The counselor wasn't the first person who disappeared. Nobody spoke. Even Mark had stopped writing. Linda lowered her voice. Years before that, a camper went missing. The words settled heavily in the room. A kid just asked quietly. Linda nodded. 8 years old. My stomach twisted. What happened? Linda looked toward the window for a moment, like she could see the woods outside. It was the last week of camp, she said. Normal summer day, swimming, canoeing, campfire that night. She paused. Then one of the kids didn't show up for lights out. The room stayed silent. They searched the whole camp, Linda continued. The lake, the trails, the woods. Did they find him? Someone asked. Linda shook her head. No. My throat felt dry. So why shut down cabin 7? Linda met my eyes. Because that's where he was last seen. The air in the room felt heavier now. Jess frowned slightly. Wait, I thought the counselor disappeared there. Linda nodded slowly. She did. A pause. 10 years later. My mind tried to piece that together. So both of them vanished from the same cabin. Linda didn't answer right away. She just stared at the table. Then she said something very quietly. They weren't the only ones. A cold feeling crawled up my spine. How many? I asked. Linda exhaled slowly. 3. Mark suddenly pushed his chair back. That's enough. His voice was sharper now. The room went still. Linda looked up at him. You know it's true. Mark rubbed his temples. The camp doesn't talk about that stuff. Maybe it should. Mark shook his head. No. His eyes moved around the table. Stories like that get kids scared. Linda's voice stayed calm. They're already scared. Nobody argued with that. After a moment, Mark left the kitchen. The door closed behind him with a dull thud. Jess leaned closer to Linda. What happened to the third person? Linda hesitated. Then she said something that made my skin crawl. The third one didn't disappear decades ago. Jess blinked. When? Linda looked toward the dark window again. Last summer. A wave of unease passed through the room. That can't be right, I said. I worked here last year, one of the counselors added. Nobody went missing. Linda nodded slowly. Not a camper. My chest tightened. Then who? She looked directly at me. A counselor. The kitchen suddenly felt too small. What cabin were they assigned to? Jess asked quietly. Linda's eyes drifted toward the forest again. You already know the answer. Nobody spoke. Outside, the wind brushed through the trees. And somewhere deep in the woods, Cabin 7 waited in the dark. Jess finally broke the silence. What was their name? Linda hesitated. Then she said it. Eric. My heart skipped. That's my name. Linda nodded slowly. I know. The room went completely still. That's not funny, I said. I'm not joking. My thoughts started racing. That doesn't make sense. I just got hired this year. Linda leaned forward. That's exactly what he said. A cold pressure built in my chest. What are you talking about? Linda's voice dropped lower. The counselor who disappeared last summer. She paused. Looked exactly like you. I shook my head. No. Jess looked between us. Wait, what? Linda continued quietly. Same height, same face, same name. The fluorescent light above the table flickered once. My stomach twisted. That's impossible. Linda reached into her bag. She pulled out something small. A photograph. Old. Bent at the corners. She slid it across the table toward me. My hands felt strangely numb as I picked it up. The photo showed a group of counselors standing in front of the camp sign. Smiling. Laughing. Normal summer picture. But one face stood in the middle. My face. Same hair. Same eyes. Same stupid half smile I always make in pictures. I stared at it for several seconds. That's not me. Linda's voice stayed calm. That's what he said too. Jess leaned over my shoulder. Her breath caught. Oh my God. I flipped the photo over. A date was written on the back. July 12. Last summer. My chest felt tight now. Because I had never been here last summer. Not that I remembered. Linda stood slowly. There's something else you should know. My eyes lifted toward her. What? Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. The missing camper. I swallowed. Yeah. Linda looked straight at me. He disappeared the same night. The lantern first appeared in cabin 7. A long silence filled the kitchen. Then she added one more thing. Every time someone goes missing here. She glanced toward the forest. The lantern starts moving again. At that exact moment, the lights in the kitchen flickered. And outside the window, A faint orange glow appeared between the trees. The chain wasn't on the door anymore. That was the first thing I noticed. The next morning, the trail looked exactly the same as always. Pine needles on the ground, the old wooden sign hanging crooked above the door. But the thick metal chain that had wrapped around the handle all summer was gone. The padlock still hung there, but it was open, swinging slowly in the breeze. I stopped in the middle of the trail. My stomach tightened in a slow, heavy way, because I knew I had seen that chain 2 days ago. Locked tight. Mark had even checked it while we were talking. But now the door sat slightly open, just a few inches. Darkness inside. I glanced back toward the main camp. Morning activities had already started. Kids shouting near the lake, canoes knocking against the dock. No one else was near the trail. I told myself I should leave. Go find Mark. Tell someone. But my feet didn't move. Something about that open door pulled at me, like a quiet invitation, or a warning. I walked slowly toward the porch. Each step felt louder than it should. The wooden boards creaked under my weight as I climbed the steps. The door moved slightly in the wind. A long, soft squeak. I pushed it open a little wider. The smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, and something else. Not rot, not mold. Something warmer, like someone had been living there. The inside of the cabin was darker than I expected. The boards over the windows blocked most of the sunlight. Only thin lines of light slipped through the cracks, enough to see the shapes inside. 6 bunk beds, 2 rows along the walls, just like every other cabin at camp. Except these beds looked different. The mattresses weren't covered in dust. I stepped inside slowly. The floor creaked under my boots. My eyes adjusted to the dim light. Most of the beds looked untouched. Thin blankets folded neatly. Old camp pillows sitting at the head. But one bed near the back of the room looked wrong. The blanket wasn't folded. It was crumpled, like someone had slept there. I stood still for a moment, listening. The forest outside moved quietly in the wind. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. My heartbeat sounded too loud in my ears. I stepped closer to the bed. Something about it made the air feel heavier, like the room didn't want me near it. The mattress dipped slightly in the middle, still shaped from someone lying there. I reached out slowly, then pulled my hand back. For a second, I wasn't sure why. Then I realized I was afraid to touch it, which was ridiculous. It was just a bed, just an old mattress in an abandoned cabin. So I forced myself to press my palm down onto the blanket and immediately jerked my hand back. The bed was warm, not slightly warm, not sun-warmed through the boards. It was body warm, like someone had been lying there minutes ago. My chest tightened. I looked around the room quickly. Empty. Every corner, every shadow. Nothing moved, but the warmth was real. I pressed my hand down again. Still warm, still fresh. Someone had been sleeping in this bed. Very recently. A slow, uneasy thought crept into my head. What if they were still here? I turned toward the door, half expecting someone to be standing there. But the doorway was empty. The forest outside looked calm. Normal. I exhaled slowly. Then something else caught my eye. On the wall beside the bed, small scratches in the wood. Thin lines, dozens of them, carved into the wall. At first they looked random, but when I leaned closer, I realized they weren't random at all. They were tally marks, groups of 5, over and over again. I counted quickly. There were too many to track easily, but there had to be hundreds, maybe more. Days. Someone had been counting days. My stomach twisted again. Why would someone stay in this cabin for that long? Unless they couldn't leave. A soft creak behind me made me spin around. The door moved slightly in the wind. Just the wind. Nothing else. I forced myself to breathe normally again. Then I noticed something else near the bed. A backpack. Old. Faded blue. Half hidden under the lower bunk. I crouched slowly and pulled it out. The zipper stuck slightly when I opened it. Inside were a few things. A flashlight, a small notebook, and a camp staff badge. I lifted the badge into the light. My chest went cold, because the photo on the badge showed the same face from the photograph Linda had shown me. My face, same hair, same eyes, same stupid half smile. The name printed below the picture read, ERIC. My hand started shaking slightly. I flipped the badge over. A date was printed on the back. Last summer. My throat felt dry again, because I had never worked here last summer. At least I didn't think I had. A faint sound came from outside. Footsteps. Slow. Moving through the pine needles. I froze. The steps stopped near the porch, right outside the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the floorboards creaked softly. Someone had stepped onto the porch. My pulse started pounding in my ears. I looked toward the doorway. A shadow stretched slowly across the floor. Tall, human, standing just outside. I held my breath. The shadow didn't move. Neither did I. Seconds passed, maybe longer. Then the shadow slowly pulled back. The porch creaked again. Footsteps moved away into the trees. I stayed frozen beside the bed, listening, but the woods went quiet again. After a long moment, I stood up slowly. My legs felt weak. I looked around the cabin one more time. The warm bed, the tally marks, the badge with my face on it. Something about this place felt wrong in a deeper way now. Not haunted, not cursed, something worse. Like the cabin wasn't just hiding a secret. It was repeating one. I picked up the small notebook from the backpack. The cover was worn and bent, like someone had opened it many times. My fingers hesitated for a moment before turning the first page. But when I finally did, the handwriting inside made my stomach drop. Because every word on the page was written in my handwriting. And the very first line said, "If you're reading this, it means you came back again." The key they mailed me looked older than the house I lived in. It was heavy, cold, made from dull brass that had turned almost green around the edges, the kind of key you don't see anymore. It arrived in a small envelope with my grandfather's name written across the top. Except my grandfather had been dead for 3 weeks. I turned the key over in my hand while sitting at the kitchen table. There was a note inside the envelope too, just one short sentence written in shaky handwriting. "The cabin is yours now." No signature, but I knew the handwriting. It was my grandfather, or at least it looked exactly like it. That was the part I couldn't stop thinking about, because the note had been postmarked 2 days after the funeral. I stared at the key again. My grandfather never talked about the cabin when I was growing up. I only knew it existed because of a few old photos in his house. A small wooden building in the woods, hunting trips, snow on the roof, That was it. No stories, no memories, just a place he used to disappear to sometimes. When the lawyer called about the inheritance, I expected paperwork, money, maybe his truck, but instead he said something strange. You've been left the property in Black Hollow. I had no idea what that meant. Then he explained. It's a hunting cabin, been in your family a long time. That was the first time I heard the name. Black Hollow. It sounded like the kind of place people warned you about. But 2 days later, the key arrived. And the note, the one that shouldn't have existed. The drive took almost 6 hours. The farther north I went, the thinner the towns became. Gas stations turned into empty dirt lots. Roads narrowed. Cell service disappeared somewhere after the last small town. By the time I reached the dirt road marked on the map, the sky had already started turning gray. Tall trees leaned over the road like they were trying to block the path. I drove slowly. Branches scraped against the truck doors. The woods felt thick, old, the kind of forest that didn't feel used to visitors. After another 15 minutes, I saw it. The cabin. It stood alone in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees. Exactly like the photos. Same dark wood. Same slanted roof. Same small front porch. But the place looked older than I expected. Weather had worn the wood almost black. One of the porch rails had broken loose and hung crooked. The windows looked dusty, like no one had been here in years. I turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy. No cars, no voices, just wind moving through the trees. I stepped out of the truck. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. Cold too, colder than it should have been for early fall. I walked toward the porch slowly. The wood creaked when I stepped onto it. Every sound felt louder out here, like the forest was listening. The door looked solid. Old oak, the kind that could survive decades of weather. The key fit perfectly. The lock clicked open with a deep metallic sound. For a moment, I just stood there. Something about opening that door felt important, like I was crossing a line. But I pushed it open anyway. The inside smelled like dust and old wood. Sunlight slipped through the windows in thin beams. The cabin was smaller than I expected. One main room, stone fireplace, wooden table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen counter along the wall, and a single bedroom door near the back. Everything looked frozen in time, like my grandfather had stepped out one day and never came back. A hunting rifle still hung above the fireplace. Boots sat near the door. A metal coffee pot rested on the stove. My chest tightened slightly. For a second, I almost expected to hear his voice. But the cabin stayed quiet. I walked slowly across the room. Dust rose under my boots. My fingers brushed across the table. Thick layer of dirt. Definitely abandoned. So how had the letter been sent? I glanced around again. Nothing looked disturbed. No fresh footprints. No signs anyone had been here recently. Then I noticed something strange. The fireplace ashes. They looked recent. Not cold gray, dust like old ashes. These still held darker patches, like a fire had burned here not long ago. I crouched down closer. The ash shifted slightly when I touched it. Still soft, still loose. Someone had used this fireplace recently. But that didn't make sense. No one knew I was coming here. At least I thought no one did. I stood up slowly. The cabin suddenly felt smaller. The silence heavier. A faint creak came from somewhere above me. I looked up. just wooden beams across the ceiling. Nothing else, but the sound had been real, like a board shifting under weight. Maybe the roof settling. Old cabins did that. Still, I found myself listening harder now. The forest outside moved quietly, branches swaying, wind brushing through the leaves. Then something else, a sound deeper in the woods. Footsteps, slow, crushing pine needles. My heart beat a little faster. I stepped toward the window, but the glass was dirty, clouded. I wiped a small circle with my sleeve and looked outside. Nothing, just trees. The footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again. After a moment, I stepped back from the window, trying to convince myself it had just been an animal. Deer maybe. Plenty of those in hunting country. Still, the feeling didn't leave. That quiet pressure in the back of my mind. Like someone had been standing out there, watching the cabin, watching me. I turned toward the bedroom door. It stood slightly open. Just a crack. Dark inside. The kind of darkness that swallowed the light from the main room. I don't know why, but something about that doorway made my chest tighten. Like my body already knew something inside that room wasn't right. I walked toward it slowly. The wooden floor creaked under every step. The air felt colder near the door. When I pushed it open, the hinges groaned softly. The bedroom looked simple. One bed, small dresser, old hunting jacket hanging on a nail in the wall. Everything covered in dust, except one thing. The bed. The blanket had been folded back, like someone had just gotten up. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I slowly reached out and touched the mattress. Cold, but not dusty. Someone had slept here. Recently. My stomach tightened again, because my grandfather had died 3 weeks ago, and no one else had a key. At least that's what I thought. Then I heard something outside. Right behind the cabin, the footsteps outside the bedroom window didn't move. They just stayed there. Whoever was behind the cabin was standing still, close enough that I could hear the slow shift of weight on the leaves. I held my breath without meaning to. The bedroom window faced the back of the woods. No porch, no trail, just trees and thick brush. If someone was standing there, they had walked through the forest to get here. The glass in the window was old and cloudy. I couldn't see anything clearly through it, only shapes. Dark trees, gray sky, but I had the strange feeling someone was standing just out of sight. Watching, waiting. My chest felt tight. I took one slow step toward the window. The floorboard creaked under my foot. The sound echoed through the room, and the footsteps outside immediately stopped shifting. Now whoever was out there was completely still, like they were listening too. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then the leaves outside rustled. Not walking, more like someone slowly stepping backward. Retreating. The sound faded deeper into the trees. After a few seconds, the forest returned to its quiet wind and branches. I stayed by the window a little longer, trying to see something through the glass. But there was nothing. Just woods. Eventually I stepped away, trying to convince myself it had been a deer, or maybe someone from a nearby property checking the land. But something about the way those footsteps stopped when the floor creaked, that felt too aware, too human. I spent the next hour looking through the rest of the cabin, partly because I was curious, partly because I didn't want to leave yet. The place felt strange, but it also felt like a piece of my grandfather I had never known. The kitchen cabinets held old canned food. Most of it expired years ago. There were jars of coffee beans, boxes of shotgun shells, a few rusted hunting knives. Nothing unusual, just the quiet leftovers of a life spent out here. But the longer I walked around the cabin, the more something started bothering me. The floor. It didn't sound right. Every cabin creaks a little. Old wood does that. But one section of the floor in the main room sounded different. Hollow. When I stepped near the fireplace, the boards made a deeper sound, like there was empty space underneath. I stopped and tapped the floor with my boot. Thunk. Definitely hollow. That didn't make sense. Cabins like this usually sat directly on stone foundations. No basements, no cellars, but the sound was obvious. Something was beneath the floor. I crouched down and brushed the dust away with my hand. The wood there looked slightly newer than the rest. Not fresh, but replaced, like someone had repaired this part years ago. Then I saw it. A small metal ring set into the board, almost hidden under the dirt. My fingers hesitated for a moment before I grabbed it. The wood lifted easily. Too easily. The board swung upward like a trapdoor, and beneath it was darkness. A narrow wooden staircase dropped down into the ground. Cold air drifted up from below. Damp, earthy, like wet stone. A root cellar. I stared at it for a long moment. My grandfather had never mentioned anything like this. Not once. And I had been in this cabin once as a kid. I barely remembered it, but I was sure I had walked across this floor before. I would have noticed a trapdoor. Wouldn't I? I leaned forward and looked down the stairs. The cellar was deeper than I expected. Stone walls, packed dirt floor. The darkness down there felt thick, like it swallowed the weak light from above. Then I noticed something else. At the bottom of the stairs sat a heavy wooden door, and across that door was a thick iron chain. The chain wrapped around the handle several times, and a large rusted padlock held it shut. My chest tightened slightly. Why would someone lock a cellar from the outside? That made no sense. Cellars usually stored food, supplies, maybe tools, but they weren't locked like this. Not with chains, not buried under the floor. I climbed down the stairs slowly. Each step creaked under my weight. The air grew colder as I descended. The smell of damp earth grew stronger. When I reached the bottom, the dirt floor felt soft under my boots. The chain on the door looked old, but not ancient. Someone had wrapped it carefully, deliberately. The padlock itself looked newer than everything else. Maybe 20 years old, maybe less. I touched the chain lightly. It rattled softly. The sound echoed through the cellar. That's when I heard something that made my stomach drop. A sound from the other side of the door. Not loud, just a faint scrape, like something moving slowly across wood. I froze, listening. The cellar became very quiet. Then another sound, a soft thud, followed by what almost sounded like breathing. My throat went dry. The sound came again, slow, uneven, like someone taking shallow breaths. Right behind the door. My mind raced through explanations. Animals could get trapped in cellars. Raccoons, foxes, even bears sometimes. But animals didn't usually stay quiet like that. This breathing felt controlled, aware, like whatever was behind that door knew someone was standing outside it. My hand slowly moved away from the chain. The cellar suddenly felt too small, too deep underground, and the air felt colder now. I took a step back, then another. The breathing behind the door stopped. The silence returned instantly, like a switch had been flipped. That somehow made it worse, because now I knew for certain. Something had been there, listening, just like I was. I climbed back up the stairs quickly, each step louder than before. When I reached the cabin floor again, the sunlight from the windows felt strangely comforting. I lowered the trapdoor back into place. The wood settled into the floor with a dull thud. For a few seconds I just stood there, staring at the boards, trying to slow my breathing, trying to think clearly. Maybe it really was an animal. Maybe the chain had been placed there to keep animals from getting inside. That made sense. It had to. But one detail kept bothering me. The chain wasn't wrapped to keep something out. It was wrapped to keep something in. I turned slowly toward the cabin door. The forest outside looked darker now. Clouds had covered most of the sky. Wind moved slowly through the trees. Then I saw something that made my chest tighten again. Fresh footprints in the dirt near the porch. They hadn't been there when I arrived. Boot prints, deep, leading from the woods, straight to the back of the cabin, and stopping right below the bedroom window. A single slow footstep, crunching through the leaves, and whoever made it stopped right at the bedroom window. The first night I heard it, I told myself it was just an animal. That's the lie I kept repeating in my head. Animal, nothing else. But the sound didn't behave like an animal. It started just after midnight. I had stayed at the cabin because driving back through the forest at night felt worse somehow. The sky had turned black, the road had vanished into shadows, and the woods felt deeper than they did during the day. So I lit a fire in the fireplace, sat at the old wooden table, tried to read one of the dusty hunting magazines I found in a drawer. But I couldn't stop thinking about the cellar, about the chain, about the breathing behind the door. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I lay down on the bed in the small bedroom, fully dressed, and closed my eyes. The forest outside hummed softly with insects. Wind brushed the roof. Branches tapped lightly against the walls. Normal night sounds. For a while I slept. Then something woke me. At first I didn't know what it was. Just that strange feeling when your body knows something is wrong before your mind catches up. My eyes opened slowly. The room was dark, except for faint moonlight slipping through the dirty window. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. Then I heard it. A slow dragging sound. Outside, behind the cabin. I held my breath. The sound moved across the ground. Not footsteps exactly. More like something being pulled, or something crawling slowly through the leaves. My chest tightened, because the sound was moving around the house. I slid quietly out of bed and stepped toward the bedroom window. The glass was still cloudy with dust. I wiped a small circle with my sleeve and looked out. The woods were dark. Moonlight barely reached the forest floor. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then something shifted between the trees. A shape, low to the ground, moving slowly. My eyes tried to focus, but the branches kept blocking the view. Whatever it was slid behind one tree, then another. The movement was strange, uneven, like it didn't walk normally, like parts of it moved at different speeds. Then it disappeared deeper into the woods. The forest went still again. I stood there for several seconds listening. Nothing. No leaves. No branches. Just silence. Finally, I stepped away from the window. Animal, I whispered quietly to myself. It had to be. but the words didn't sound convincing in the empty room. The next morning, I checked the ground behind the cabin. The dirt was soft enough to hold tracks, and there were definitely tracks, but they didn't look right. At first glance, they looked like boot prints. Human, but the spacing between them was wrong. Too uneven. Some prints were close together. Others were nearly 3 feet apart. Like whoever made them sometimes walked and sometimes dragged themselves forward. I crouched down for a closer look. The heel marks were deep, deeper than a normal step, almost like the person had been leaning heavily backward, pulling something, or maybe pulling themselves. A cold feeling crept up my spine. I stood up quickly and looked toward the woods. The trees stared back silently. Then I noticed something else. The tracks didn't lead toward the cabin. They led away from it. From the back wall. From the direction of the cellar. That night I stayed awake. I didn't even try to sleep. I kept the fireplace burning low and sat in the chair facing the front door. The cabin felt smaller in the dark. Every creak in the wood made my head turn. Every gust of wind sounded like movement. Midnight passed slowly. Then the forest went quiet again. That same unnatural silence. Like everything outside had stopped breathing. My hands tightened around the arms of the chair. And then, the dragging sound returned. Slow, heavy, moving through the leaves behind the cabin. Closer this time. I stood up carefully and moved toward the bedroom window again. The sound scraped across the ground. Pause, drag, pause, drag, closer. My heart pounded in my ears. When I reached the window and looked out, the moonlight had shifted enough to light the clearing slightly. And this time, I saw it clearly. Something was crawling out of the tree line, toward the cabin. At first, I thought it was a person. The shape had arms, legs, a body, but the way it moved made my stomach twist. It crawled slowly, dragging its legs behind it like they didn't work. Its arms pulled the body forward one slow motion at a time. The head hung low, almost brushing the ground. My breath caught in my throat, because the shape looked thin. Too thin, like a skeleton wrapped in loose skin. It stopped about 20 feet from the cabin, then slowly lifted its head. Moonlight touched its face, and for one horrifying second, I thought I recognized it. The beard, the hollow cheeks, the same shape of nose. My grandfather's face, or something wearing it. My legs felt weak, because my grandfather had been buried 3 weeks ago. The thing outside tilted its head slightly, like it was listening. Then its body turned slowly toward the back of the cabin, toward the place where the cellar sat beneath the floor. It crawled the rest of the way across the clearing, dragging itself across the dirt, until it reached the wall. Then it disappeared from my view. I rushed quietly back into the main room. The cabin floor creaked under my feet. And that's when I heard it, directly beneath me. The trapdoor. Something scratched softly against the wood from below. A slow dragging movement. Then a dull thud, like something pressing upward. My heart hammered in my chest, because whatever had been crawling through the woods was now inside the cellar. And something deep in my gut told me one terrible thing. It hadn't been trying to get out. It had been trying to get back in. The scratching beneath the floor stopped. For several seconds, the cabin went completely silent. Then from below, I heard the slow metal rattle of the cellar chain moving. The fog wasn't supposed to be there. When I started the hike that morning, the sky was clear, blue, quiet. The kind of calm weather that makes you feel confident in the mountains. By noon, everything had changed. The fog rolled in fast, not slowly drifting like normal mountain mist. It came down like someone pulling a gray curtain across the world. One minute I could see the trail ahead. The next minute it was gone. Just white. Thick, heavy white that swallowed the trees and the sky and the ground all at once. At first I wasn't worried. I'd hiked plenty of trails before. I had a map, a compass, and enough supplies to last a few days. The trail was supposed to follow the ridge and circle back toward the parking area by evening. Simple loop. Easy hike. That's what I thought. But the fog did something strange to the mountains. It erased everything. The trees faded into pale shapes. The trail turned into a blur of wet dirt and scattered rocks. Even sound felt different, like the fog was swallowing it before it could travel. I walked slower, carefully, checking the compass every few minutes. North should have been to my right. The ridge should have stayed on my left. But after about an hour, something felt wrong. The ground started sloping downward. That shouldn't have happened. I stopped and looked around, though there was nothing to see except endless white. I pulled the map from my backpack and held it close to my face. According to the map, the trail stayed high along the ridge for at least another mile. No drops, no valleys, but my boots were definitely heading downhill. I turned around and tried to find the trail behind me. It was gone, completely gone. The fog had erased it like it never existed. A strange feeling crept into my chest. Not panic, not yet. Just that quiet awareness that something wasn't going the way it should. I checked the compass again. The needle wobbled slightly, then settled. North, but when I turned that direction and walked for about 10 minutes, the ground kept sloping down. That's when the first real wave of worry hit me. Mountains are dangerous when you lose the trail. Everything starts looking the same. You start second-guessing every direction. And fog makes it worse. Much worse. I tried to stay calm, picked a direction and moved slowly. Marked a few trees with a small piece of tape from my pack, just in case I ended up walking in circles. The forest around me grew quieter the deeper I walked. No birds, no wind, just the soft crunch of leaves under my boots. And the fog, always the fog. After another 30 minutes, I noticed something strange. The trees had changed. The ones near the ridge were tall pines. These trees were different, thicker, older. Their branches twisted low like they'd been growing in darkness for a long time. Moss covered the trunks in heavy patches. The ground felt softer, damp. I checked the map again. There was no valley like this anywhere on the trail. Not even close. That meant one thing. I had walked completely off the route. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I kept moving anyway. Standing still in the fog felt worse than walking. At least walking made it feel like I was doing something. But after another 20 minutes, a new problem appeared. The fog got thicker. So thick the trees started fatting only a few feet away. The forest turned into pale shapes floating in white. My world shrank down to a small bubble around me. 10 feet, maybe less. It felt like walking through a dream, or a place that didn't fully exist. Then something else happened. I heard a sound. At first it was faint, just a dull wooden creak somewhere ahead. I stopped walking. The sound came again, a slow groan, like old wood shifting in the wind. But there was no wind. The forest was completely still. I turned my head slowly, trying to find where it came from. Then I saw it. A shape in the fog. Straight lines. Sharp corners. Not trees. Not rocks. Something man-made. I stepped closer. The fog thinned just enough for the shape to appear. A cabin. Small. Old. Half hidden between the trees. For a moment, I just stood there staring at it. Because it made no sense. I had studied the map before starting this hike. Every trail marker. Every shelter. Every ranger station. There was nothing out here. No buildings. No cabins. Nothing. Yet somehow this one sat quietly in the middle of the forest like it had always been there. The wood walls were dark and weathered. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. A narrow porch stretched across the front. No lights. No smoke. No signs of life. Just silence. Relief washed over me first. A real shelter meant safety. Dry ground. Maybe even someone who knew the area better than I did. I walked toward it slowly. My boots creaked across the wooden porch. The boards felt damp but solid. The front door stood a few inches open. That stopped me. I knocked lightly. Hello. My voice sounded strange in the fog. Soft. Almost swallowed. No answer. I waited. Nothing moved inside. I pushed the door a little wider. It opened with a slow groan. The inside of the cabin was dark but simple. One small table. 2 chairs. A stone fireplace. A narrow hallway leading toward what looked like a back room. Dust covered most surfaces. But something about the dust didn't look right. Some areas were disturbed, like something had brushed across them recently. I stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked under my weight. The air smelled old. Not rotten, just stale, like a place that hadn't seen fresh air in years. I set my backpack down beside the table and looked around. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than the forest outside. Then I noticed something strange. The fireplace. Ash sat inside it. Fresh ash. Gray and soft. Not the dark, hardened kind left from old fires. Someone had used this fireplace recently. But there were no supplies. No blankets. No food. Nothing that suggested anyone lived here. Just that one sign. A fire that had burned not long ago. A chill crept slowly up my spine. I walked toward the back hallway. Each step echoed softly through the cabin. The hallway led to one small bedroom. A narrow bed sat against the wall. The blanket on top looked thin but clean. Too clean. Like it had been shaken out recently. I stared at the bed for several seconds. Because something about it felt wrong. Not messy. Not abandoned. Prepared. Like someone expected to sleep there tonight. I turned slowly and looked back toward the front door. The fog outside pressed against the windows like pale smoke. The forest was completely silent. And that's when a thought slipped quietly into my mind. If someone had used the fireplace, and someone had prepared the bed, then where were they now? Because I was standing in their cabin, and the front door had been open, like they had just stepped outside. Only the fog outside was thick enough that I could barely see the porch, which meant one uncomfortable possibility kept growing in the back of my mind. Whoever lived here might still be very close, standing somewhere in that fog, watching the cabin, waiting for me to fall asleep. The first thing that bothered me wasn't the fog. It was the book. I didn't notice it right away. For a while I just stood inside the cabin, listening to the silence and trying to decide if staying here was a good idea. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a living thing. Inside, the air felt still and stale. But at least it was shelter. And shelter matters when you're lost in the mountains. I walked back to the small table near the front door. My backpack sat on the floor where I left it. My compass and map were still inside, useless now that the world outside had turned into white nothing. That's when I saw the book. It lay in the middle of the table. Thick, dark green cover, edges worn soft with age. At first I thought it was just an old notebook someone left behind. But when I touched it, dust lifted into the air like a quiet breath. The cover felt rough under my fingers. On the front, faded gold letters spelled 2 words. Guest log. I frowned slightly. A guest book in the middle of nowhere didn't make much sense. But curiosity won. I pulled the chair out and sat down slowly. The wood creaked under my weight. Then I opened the book. The pages were yellow and thin. The first entry was written in careful, old-fashioned handwriting. I blinked. That made me lean closer. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear enough to read. Stayed here during the early winter storm. Cabin saved our lives. Whoever built it deserves thanks. Underneath it was a name. Then another entry below that. Different handwriting. Short message. Another name. I turned the page. More entries. Some of them were long stories about hunters or hikers getting caught in bad weather. Others were just simple messages. Grateful for the shelter. Stayed one night, left supplies. Snowed in for 2 days. Each one signed with a name and a date. A strange calm spread through me while I read them, because suddenly the cabin felt less mysterious. It wasn't some abandoned building lost in the forest. It was a shelter, a hidden place hikers used when they got into trouble. Someone must have built it decades ago, and over time people just kept using it, leaving messages behind. That made sense. For the first time since getting lost, I felt a small wave of relief. I flipped another page. The entries grew more modern. Different styles of handwriting. Different stories. One guy wrote about getting chased by a black bear. Another talked about hiking the ridge trail and losing the path in heavy snow. I noticed something else too. The dates never skipped too many years. Someone always found this place eventually, even though it wasn't on my map. I kept turning pages. The ink grew darker on newer entries. The stories shorter. One person had drawn a small smiley face next to their name. Another left a joke about the cabin having better beds than their apartment. I almost laughed at that. But then I reached the last few pages. And that's when the calm feeling faded. The final entries were very recent. Only a few years old. One from 3 years ago. Another from 2. Then one from last year. The handwriting looked rushed. Uneven. The message was short. Fog rolled in. Couldn't find the trail. Glad this place was here. No smiley face. No long story. Just that sentence. And a name. I turned the page again. Another entry sat below it. This one had no date. Just a single line written in shaky pen. Don't stay here after dark. I stared at those words longer than I expected. Something about the handwriting felt wrong. The letters leaned sideways, like whoever wrote them had been in a hurry. Or scared. I felt a slow chill creep across my shoulders. But curiosity pushed me forward again. I turned the final page. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Because the ink was fresh. Still dark. Still sharp. Not faded like the others. And the handwriting looked familiar. Very familiar. My eyes scanned the line slowly. Then my chest tightened, because the name written there was mine, exactly the way I write it. Same letters, same curve in the last N. Underneath the name was a date. Today's date. My mouth went dry. For several seconds, I just stared at it, trying to understand what I was seeing, because I knew one thing for certain. I had never touched this book before. I hadn't even known the cabin existed until an hour ago. Yet somehow my name sat on the last page like I had signed it myself. My heart started beating faster. I reached out and touched the ink with my fingertip. Dry. Completely dry. That meant it hadn't just been written seconds ago. It had been there for a while. But that was impossible. A slow, uneasy thought crept into my mind. Maybe someone else had the same name. That had to be it. Names repeat all the time. But then I looked closer. The handwriting. It wasn't just similar. It was identical. I knew it the same way you recognize your own reflection in a mirror. That strange little hook I always add to the first letter. The way the last letter curves slightly upward. Every detail matched. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. I flipped the page back and forth several times, looking for anything that could explain it. Some kind of joke. Some kind of trick. But there was nothing else. Just the same empty page with my name staring back at me. Then something else caught my attention. Beneath the name, very faint, almost invisible, there were marks scratched into the paper. Not written. Scratched, like someone had pressed a pen down without ink. I tilted the page toward the window light, and slowly the hidden words appeared. 3 small lines, barely readable, but clear enough. You stayed. You slept. It noticed. My hand jerked away from the book. The chair legs scraped loudly across the floor as I stood up. The sound echoed through the cabin. For a moment, the silence afterward felt too heavy. I looked toward the bedroom hallway. The thin blanket on the bed. The fresh ash in the fireplace. And suddenly, a new thought crept into my mind. One that made my skin crawl. If someone had written my name in that book, if those scratched words were meant for me, then that meant something else too. Someone had been inside this cabin before I arrived. Someone who knew my name. And maybe, someone who expected me to stay the night. A soft sound came from outside. Very faint. Just a dull step on the wooden porch. My breath stopped. The fog outside the windows moved slowly like pale smoke. Then another sound. A quiet creak from the front porch boards. Like someone shifting their weight. Standing right outside the door. Waiting. As if they already knew I was inside. The cabin was gone. When I opened my eyes that morning, the first thing I saw was the forest. Not the wooden ceiling. Not the dusty walls. Just trees. Gray morning light filtered through branches above me, and for several seconds my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. I was lying on cold ground. Wet leaves pressed against my jacket. My backpack rested beside me, and the place where the cabin should have been was empty. I sat up slowly. My neck felt stiff. My hands were cold. The forest air smelled damp and heavy. For a long moment, I just stared at the space around me, trying to make sense of it. Because I remembered falling asleep in that cabin. I remembered the bed, the thin blanket, the quiet creaking of the walls. I remembered lying there with my eyes open, listening to footsteps on the porch outside. And then, nothing. My memory ended there. But now the cabin was gone. Completely gone. No walls, no porch, no door, no broken boards or scattered nails. Just forest floor. Just moss and leaves, and twisted tree roots stretching in every direction. A slow wave of confusion rolled through my chest. I stood up quickly and turned in a slow circle. Maybe I had walked in my sleep. Maybe I had wandered away from the cabin somehow. But that idea fell apart the moment I looked around. Because the trees around me were thick and old. Roots pushed up through the ground like bones. Moss covered everything. The kind of moss that takes years to grow. Not something that appears overnight. And yet I had fallen asleep right here. Inside a cabin that now didn't exist. I ran a hand through my hair and looked for any sign of it. Any sign at all. But there was nothing. Not even a mark in the dirt where a building had once stood. The ground was smooth and natural. Untouched. Like the cabin had never been there. A quiet unease settled into my stomach. Maybe I was still dreaming. That thought lingered for a moment. But the cold air on my skin felt real. The ache in my legs from yesterday's hike felt real too. So I picked up my backpack and tried to focus on something practical. The fog had thinned during the night. Not completely gone, but light enough that I could see farther into the trees now. That meant one thing. I had a better chance of finding the trail. If I moved carefully. If I stayed calm. The sooner I started walking, the sooner I could get out of this forest and laugh about the strange night later. At least that's what I told myself. I checked my compass. The needle settled quickly. North. I picked a direction and started walking. The forest was quiet again. Not peaceful quiet. Just that same heavy silence I'd noticed yesterday. No birds. No wind. Even the leaves barely moved. My boots crunched softly across the damp ground. Step by step, I moved deeper through the trees. Every few minutes, I glanced back over my shoulder. Part of me expected to see the cabin behind me, standing exactly where it had been last night. But each time there was only empty forest. After about 20 minutes of walking, something strange happened. The ground changed. It became flatter, less tangled with roots. Then I noticed a narrow gap between the trees ahead. A trail. I felt a small rush of relief. Finally, the path was thin but clear enough to follow. Packed dirt with scattered stones pressed into it. Exactly the kind of trail hikers create over time. I stepped onto it and started moving faster. But after only a few steps, something caught my eye. Footprints. Fresh ones. They were pressed clearly into the damp dirt. Deep enough that the edges hadn't collapsed yet. Someone had walked this trail recently. Very recently. At first, that made me feel better. Other hikers meant I wasn't completely lost. But then I noticed something strange. The footprints all moved in one direction. Forward. None came back the other way. I crouched down and studied them more closely. They looked like normal hiking boots. Medium size. Heavy tread. Probably a man. But there was something unsettling about the pattern. The steps were uneven. Some prints were close together. Others stretched farther apart. Like the person had been walking faster and faster. Or maybe running. I stood up slowly and looked down the trail. The footprints continued straight ahead, fading into the trees. I followed them. It seemed like the smartest choice. If someone else had walked this path recently, it might lead somewhere useful. Maybe even back to the main trail. So I kept moving. Step after step. The forest slowly shifted around me. The trees grew thinner. More light filtered through the branches. And for a moment, I felt hopeful again, until I reached the bend in the trail. That's where everything stopped making sense. The footprints ended, not faded, not turned around, just ended, right in the middle of the path. I stood there staring at the last print. It pressed clearly into the dirt. Heel, toe, perfectly shaped. Then nothing. No next step. No side tracks. No sign the person had jumped or turned. The trail ahead remained untouched. Smooth dirt. No marks at all. Like the person had taken one final step and vanished. A slow chill spread across my back. I looked around the trees carefully, half expecting to see someone hiding nearby. But the forest stood silent and empty. Then another thought crept quietly into my mind. Those footprints, the size, the shape, they looked familiar. Too familiar. My chest tightened as I slowly lifted my own boot and placed it beside the final print. The shapes matched perfectly. Same tread, same worn corner near the heel. The last set of footprints on that trail were mine, which meant something that made my stomach twist. I had walked this path already, before, but I had no memory of doing it. And if those prints were mine, then that meant the trail didn't lead out of the forest. It led somewhere else, somewhere I had already been, somewhere in the fog, somewhere near the place where a cabin had stood last night, before disappearing without a trace. The old woman watched me too closely. Not the normal kind of watching you get from someone renting out a property. This was different. Her eyes stayed on me the entire time, like she was trying to memorize my face, or maybe measure how long I had left. "You understand the rule," she said again. Her voice was dry and thin, like paper sliding across wood. I stood on the porch beside my backpack and nodded. 3 nights. Yeah, you mentioned that in the message. She didn't smile. Most landlords smile when they're getting paid. She just stared. The cabin sat behind her at the edge of a wide clearing. Tall trees circled the property like dark walls. The road that brought me here had been nothing more than a narrow dirt path cutting through miles of forest. No neighbors. No power lines. Just woods and quiet. Exactly what I had been looking for. I worked remotely and needed somewhere isolated for a few days. Somewhere I could write, think, and stay offline. When I saw the listing online, it almost looked too perfect. Cheap price. Beautiful photos. Quiet mountain retreat. But the description had one strange line. Guests may stay a maximum of 3 nights. At the time, I assumed it was just some weird house rule. Now standing here with the old woman staring at me, it felt different. She held out a small brass key. Her hand trembled slightly. 3 nights, she repeated. After that, you leave. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the woods behind the cabin. Just for a second. Then back to me. I took the key. Is there a reason for that rule? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Just the rule. She turned away before I could ask anything else. Walked slowly down the dirt path toward the old truck parked near the trees. The engine started with a rough cough. Gravel crunched under the tires. And then she was gone. Just like that. Leaving me alone with the cabin. And that strange rule echoing quietly in my mind. 3 nights. The place looked even better up close. Weathered wooden walls. A small stone chimney. A porch with 2 old rocking chairs that creaked gently when the wind touched them. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin was simple but comfortable. One main room with a fireplace and a wooden table. a small kitchen tucked into the corner, and a short hallway leading to a bedroom and bathroom. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows. It painted soft, yellow shapes across the floorboards. I walked slowly through the rooms, letting the quiet settle around me. The furniture looked old but clean. Someone had taken care of the place. The bed was made neatly. A stack of firewood sat beside the hearth. Even a small lantern rested on the table in case the power went out, which seemed possible out here. Everything looked normal. Too normal. But the old woman's warning still lingered in the back of my mind. 3 nights. Why 3? Why not 4? Why not a week? I shrugged the thought away. People make weird rules all the time. Maybe she just didn't want long-term renters. Maybe something had happened in the past. Either way, I wasn't planning to stay long. 2 nights at most. Just enough time to write a few chapters and enjoy the quiet. I set my backpack down and opened the windows. Fresh forest air drifted inside. The trees swayed gently outside the clearing. For a while, everything felt peaceful. I spent the afternoon working at the table near the window, typing, drinking coffee, listening to the soft sounds of the forest. Birds, wind through leaves, the occasional crack of a distant branch. Hours passed without me noticing. Eventually, the sunlight shifted toward evening. Golden light filled the clearing outside. I stretched and stepped onto the porch. The forest looked darker now. The tall trees swallowed most of the light before it reached the ground. A cool breeze brushed across the clearing. The rocking chairs creaked softly. For the first time that day, a small, uneasy feeling crept into my chest. The place felt different in the evening. Quieter, heavier. I couldn't explain why. I walked a little farther from the cabin and looked toward the dirt road where the old woman had driven away earlier. Nothing moved there now. Just trees and shadows slowly growing longer. Then something caught my eye. On the far side of the clearing, near the tree line, a narrow wooden post stuck out of the ground. I hadn't noticed it earlier. Curious, I walked closer. The grass around it looked slightly flattened, like people had stood here before. The post held a small metal plate nailed to the top. The writing on it was scratched and faded, but I could still read it. 3 thin lines carved into the metal. Night 1, Night 2, Night 3. Underneath those words, someone had scratched something else. The letters were rough and uneven, like they'd been carved quickly with a knife. Leave before the 4th. A strange chill slid down my back. I stood there for a long moment staring at the sign. Wind rustled softly through the trees. Behind me, the cabin creaked. Just normal wood sounds settling in the cool air. Still, something about the sign felt wrong. Not like a joke. Not like decoration. More like a warning someone had left behind. I turned slowly and walked back toward the cabin. The porch boards groaned under my boots. The inside felt darker now. The shadows in the corners looked deeper than before. I flipped on the lights. They flickered once, then steadied. I told myself again that the rule didn't matter. I wasn't staying long enough for it to matter. 2 nights, maybe less. Still, when I locked the front door for the night, my eyes drifted toward the windows, toward the forest beyond the clearing. Something about those trees bothered me. The way they stood so close together. The way the darkness between them looked almost solid. And for a brief second, I had the strange feeling someone might already be standing out there, watching the cabin, waiting for the first night to end. Because according to the sign outside, I had exactly 3 nights here. and whoever carved that warning into the metal plate seemed very certain about what happened if someone stayed for a fourth. The scratching started before midnight. At first it was so faint I thought it was the wind dragging branches across the walls. Just a soft scrape. Pause. Another scrape. I was sitting at the table with my laptop, trying to finish a paragraph I had already rewritten 5 times. My mind kept drifting back to the sign outside the clearing. Night 1. Night 2. Night 3. Leave before the 4th. I had laughed about it earlier that afternoon, even said it out loud just to hear how silly it sounded. But when the sun went down, the forest changed again. The quiet grew deeper. The shadows stretched farther across the clearing. And that rule didn't feel so funny anymore. The scratching came again. Longer this time. Slow. Deliberate. Like something dragging a fingernail across the wood siding. I looked up from the laptop. The cabin lights hummed softly above me. The room felt warm from the fire burning in the hearth. Everything inside looked normal. But the sound came again. From the left wall this time. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. My stomach tightened a little. Probably an animal. Squirrels, raccoons, something small climbing around the cabin. That made sense. I pushed the chair back and walked toward the wall. The scratching stopped immediately. Just like that. The silence afterward felt strange. Like something had frozen the moment it realized I was listening. I stood there for a few seconds. Nothing. I leaned closer to the wall, almost pressing my ear against the wood. Still nothing. Just the faint crackle of the fireplace behind me. I let out a quiet breath and stepped away. Animals. That was all it was. The woods were full of them. I returned to the table and tried to focus again. 10 minutes passed. Maybe 15. Then the scratching started again. This time it came from the opposite side of the cabin. Near the bedroom. Scrape. Scrape. A slow dragging sound across the outside boards. I closed the laptop slowly. "All right," I muttered. My voice sounded small in the quiet room. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and walked down the hallway. The bedroom window faced the direction of the noise. The scratching stopped again as soon as I entered the room. Just like before. I stepped closer to the window and aimed the flashlight outside. The beam cut through the darkness and swept across the clearing. Nothing. Just tall grass moving gently in the breeze. The tree line stood dark and still beyond it. No animals. No movement. I stood there longer than I needed to, because something about the pattern bothered me. The sound always stopped the moment I went to check it. Like whatever was outside knew exactly where I was inside the cabin. I turned off the flashlight and went back to the main room. The fire had burned lower now. Soft orange light flickered across the walls. I sat down again, but I didn't open the laptop this time. I just listened. Minutes passed slowly. The cabin creaked occasionally as the night air cooled the wood. The forest outside stayed silent. Then the scratching returned. But this time, it wasn't on the wall. It was underneath the floor. A dull dragging sound moved slowly across the boards beneath my feet. I froze. The sound traveled from one side of the cabin to the other. Slow, careful, like something crawling underneath the house. The cabin stood on short wooden supports, lifting it just a few feet off the ground. I remembered noticing that earlier in the afternoon. Enough space for animals to hide underneath. But this didn't sound like animals. It sounded heavier. The dragging stopped directly beneath the table where I sat. For a long moment there was nothing. Then came 3 slow taps. Knock, knock, knock. My chest tightened. Because the taps weren't random. They were spaced perfectly, like someone knocking on a door. From underneath the floor. I stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping against the boards. The sound beneath the floor stopped instantly. Again, that same strange pattern. It moved when I wasn't near it, and froze when I listened. My eyes drifted toward the front door. Part of me suddenly wanted to leave the cabin right then. Grab my bag. Walk straight to the road. 3 nights or not. But the forest outside was completely dark now. And the old woman had said the nearest town was miles away. Walking those roads at night didn't sound much better than staying here. Still, something about the scratching felt wrong. So I reached for my phone. No signal. Not surprising. But I still had the widow's number saved from our earlier messages. Maybe she had Wi-Fi calling or something. Maybe she could explain what lived around here. I dialed. The call rang twice, then went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. I typed a quick message instead. Something scratching around the cabin, probably animals, just checking if that's normal out here. The message sent, or at least it looked like it did. I set the phone on the table and waited. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. No reply. The scratching started again. This time it came from the roof. A slow scrape across the wooden shingles. Then another. Something moving carefully above my head. I grabbed the flashlight again and stepped outside onto the porch. Cold night air rushed across my face. The clearing looked darker than it had the first night. The moon hid behind thick clouds. Only the lantern above the door cast a weak circle of light across the porch. I aimed the flashlight toward the roof. Nothing. The beam slid across the wooden shingles. No animals. No branches. Just empty roof. But the scratching continued, moving slowly from one side to the other. Directly above me. I took a step back into the clearing and aimed the light higher. The beam reached the roof line, and for a split second, I thought I saw something shift. A shape sliding across the peak of the cabin. Too fast to identify. Then the roof went silent again. My heartbeat thumped loudly in my ears. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed across the clearing and disappeared into the trees. No answer. Only the forest watching quietly from the darkness. Then something else happened. The porch light flickered once, then twice, and suddenly the scratching returned. But now it came from every side of the cabin. Walls, roof, under the floor, all at once. Dozens of slow scraping sound circling the structure. Not frantic, not loud, just patient, like something was testing the cabin, feeling along the wood, looking for a way inside. I stepped backward toward the door. The phone in my pocket vibrated suddenly. I pulled it out. A message from the widow. Just 3 words. Leave tonight. My stomach tightened as I read it again. Leave tonight. No explanation. No apology. Just that warning. Before I could reply, another sound came from behind me. Inside the cabin. A slow creak from the hallway. I turned slowly. The front door was still open behind me. The lantern light stretched across the wooden floor inside. And halfway down the hallway, the bedroom door was moving. It creaked open a few inches, then a few inches more. Very slowly, like someone standing inside the room was pushing it open. but I had been the only person in the cabin. At least, until the third night.